Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Redemption in a Worthy World in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 26, Fire Watch. The dark early morning of the Uchiha household and contemplated what he was about to do. He was offering himself as bait to entice Orochimaru into a meeting that would inevitably go south. The only question was which one of them would be caught in the trap first. The snake or the one-eyed hawk. He'd told the children, and they increasingly were his children, somehow, that he was leaving on a mission and would be back within the month. He'd deputized Kakashi to act as his vaguely similar substitute, and they knew him enough it wasn't a surprise. Normally, Kat might wander by on a patrol, but she was joining them, to Indra's quiet astonishment, swapping out for Danzo's tool monkey at the last moment. While it was a relief to have one less confirmed root agent to worry about, Indra now just had to worry about all of the unconfirmed root agents he would bet his other eye were mingling among squads even now. Instead, he was worried about Sasuke, because Sasuke was worried about him. Naruto and Sakura were young enough and still, somehow, innocent enough, that his survival was an obvious fact. Indra was an adult and a cool ninja training them, so of course he'd be fine. Sasuke knew better, and that night, he'd simply sat in the corner of Indra's room until he dozed off, unwilling to part from the only family member he wasn't planning to kill. Indra had honestly expected another argument, but Sasuke seemed determined to keep a stiff upper lip this time. So Indra had left a note on the kitchen table, a promise he knew was deeply stupid to make, but one he made all the same. 3 little words, underlined in black ink. I'm coming back. The squads of 60, comprised of 12 5-man teams in turn, each peeled off one by one as they crossed the land of fire. Orochimaru's spies, for there were still undoubtedly spies, would have perceived a large Umbu force leaving the village, but one that had scattered to the far corners of the elemental nations. Some of the squads created shadow clones that went on to perform B-rank bounty hunting missions or guard duty for reasonably secure nobles, masking their numbers even further. Indra's squad consisted of Kat, with her purple hair, Beetle, a massive giant of a man who had to be an Akimichi, Pheasant, a short auburn-haired man, and Raven, a cloaked figure who rarely spoke and was a painfully obvious distraction/root agent. So of course, that meant both Raven and one other Umbu were root. The obvious spy who couldn't be a spy because they were so obvious was another one of those endless little games Indra was familiar with from when he and Sai ran the Umbu under Naruto's rule. The obvious spy was of course still a spy, and the hidden secondary spy was meant to act under the radar. When that spy was caught, the enemy, assured they had discovered the hidden threat, would remain comfortably ignorant until the obvious-looking spy shoved 12 chopsticks into their brain. That had been a memorable mission for Sai. They spent 2 weeks moving through the autumn forests of the Land of Fire, at a time when the landscape lived up to its name as leaves changed color and the countryside was alight with reds, yellows, and oranges in every direction. In this environment, even Naruto could be stealthy. As they moved northwest, the weather began to turn, becoming measurably cold and making each member of the team pull their cloaks tighter around them or occasionally shiver while standing watch. As the painfully obvious bait, they allowed themselves the luxury of a fire at night, which helped. Still, as the trees gradually thinned out and the land grew smooth, the wind picked up as well, and soon Indra was spreading beeswax balm over his chapped lips and ignoring the smug looks Kat was sending his way. He had chosen to remain a mere jonin, after all, so he didn't get an Umbu mask or armor. Before they had set out, Kat had offered him a set of silver-gray Umbu armor and he'd declined. He always preferred to be fast on his feet, and while armor wouldn't slow him down, it also wouldn't provide any real protection against Orochimaru's Kusanagi sword. How the Snake Sunin had gotten his grimy hands on such an artifact, he'd never said, but Indra could guess. They spent time each night around the fire going over the details of the plan over and over, even though they'd memorized each part by now. What the plan was if Orochimaru rallied the Sound Five and attempted a breakout from the cordon. If he released the prisoners first to occupy their attention? If he slipped through their grasp at the southern hideout, how the other cordons would respond? How they would respond if the Edo Tensei was used? Endless contingencies, but Indra knew in his bones it would only make a marginal difference. The bastard would have something planned. Burning Kabuto alive with Amaterasu had given the Sound Village time to plan, and the simple knowledge someone was going to hunt you made all the difference in the world. Danzo had been displeased when Indra had explained what he'd done, grumbling that Orochimaru was now 45% more likely to not even take the meeting in the first place, traps or no. But Danzo had only used Orochimaru as an agent and often at a distance. Indra had lived, shoulder to skin shedding shoulder with the man, had seen the dark hunger in those golden eyes and knew even with forewarning, even with a spy feeding the Sound Village every detail about their plan, he could not resist the lure Indra dangled. A mature Mangekyo Sharinan, the gateway to the Rinnegan, which opened the way for all the jutsu in the world, as well as true rebirth. Oh no, Orochimaru would be there. Of course, it wasn't all strategy, tactics, and business. They were still people underneath the masks, even the root agents. They needed to eat and drink and piss and talk, all the things normal ninja needed to do too. Around their fire they also spoke about the best places to eat in Fire Country. Beetle knew of a great fire pepper roast down south, the worst conditions they'd fought or slept in, Raven's 6-month isolated guard post in the Suna Desert with 2 Sunanin who didn't speak a word of the common tongue, and the strangest things they'd seen, Cat's encounter with a semi-sentient bull that had 2 heads. If he'd been playing for keeps, Indra could have offered up meeting the Sage of the 6 Paths, or the alien alteration effects of the Karma Seal, but he was sure the first would have just been ignored and the second would start Danzo down a terrifying research road that could only end in mercy killings. The Umbu head already had too much knowledge about sealing for Indra's comfort, but he was 70% sure the man didn't have a time travel seal in his possession. The conflict Sarada's strike team had gone through to obtain theirs was proof enough. The Uzumaki had kept some secrets buried deep beneath the waterline, deeper than any living thing really ought to be. Pheasant tapped him on the shoulder in a silent code that meant, "Switch watch in 5 minutes, replace my shadow clone seamlessly," which necessitated a transformation jutsu and a substitution jutsu simultaneously. Difficult for a man with one hand, but he'd done it before. Indra gave a silent acknowledgement as the man seemingly returned to his post when a voice spoke up. "If this mission goes as planned, what will you do with Orochimaru?" Beetle was sitting to his left, in his blind spot while Raven remained to his right, perfectly visible. Indra was pretty sure it was Beetle's voice, so he answered honestly. "Keep him locked in seal, he cannot escape, forced to watch as the world moves on without him." Despite his grand delusions about becoming a great wind to stir up change, he has always been stuck on the ground. A worm rather than a WYRM. More a gecko than a dragon. But still alive, just in case. Sounds appropriately ironic and cruel, Beetle approved. Indra shrugged. "If you got to pick, what would you do?" Oh, Cat exclaimed. "Let's have everyone answer, and if it's boring, they have to drink. That'll put us to sleep." Pretending like the watered-down beer they had counted as alcohol was an amusing fiction, as far as Indra was concerned, but considering he planned to get root agents rehabilitated as early as possible, this was a good test case. "I'm game," he announced with a slight smirk and dug around in his pack for one of the cans with a cold storage seal on it. Pheasant and Raven joined as well while Beetle looked confused. "Well, Indra already said his idea, so we vote, I guess." Cat and Raven looked at one another across the fire and Indra swore the corvid beak chattered slightly in silent laughter. "Anyone who thinks Indra's fate for Orochimaru is lame, raise a glass." She raised her own can, as did Pheasant. The Uchiha raised his one visible eyebrow and popped the tab on the can with his thumb. "Why?" The auburn-haired man made a disapproving noise. "It's pretty lame, eh? So he's just stuck in a glass box and gets to watch the rest of the world until he croaks. I mean, what you talked about sounds like it fits, but he'd still enjoy getting something to look at. I say, total sensory deprivation, like in Umbu training. Except for a lot longer than an hour." Apparently Cat was the game show host tonight. "All right Indra, that's 2 sips." Obligingly, Indra took 2 pulls of the watery beer. Nobody was getting drunk off of this, but their traveling cover story as a group of noble children roughing it with the peasants meant they had some interesting and extraneous items in their packs. Of course, nearly everyone could be turned into a weapon with enough ingenuity, but at the moment, the beer was the important bit. "Okay, so who thinks Pheasant's idea was lame?" "Stop saying lame," complained Beetle. "You sound like an old lady trying to be cool for the kids. It's embarrassing." She threw her empty food tin at him as they both raised a glass anyway. Oh, the simple joys of having two hands. Beetle gave his reasoning. I mean, that would drive him mad, well, madder, but there's no pain to it, just psych stuff. If there's no pain, it's not a real punishment. Indra made a skeptical noise as Pheasant lifted his mask to drink and everyone obligingly looked away. Beetle's suggestion then. The big man crossed his arms. I say flay him alive with razor wire and heal him enough so he's alive for it all. Then make him eat it. The whole snake motif he's got going, with the eyes and the skin-shedding substitution jutsu, make him take it to its logical conclusion. An Ouroboros, devouring itself forever. Raven let out a low whistle as Pheasant and Cat mulled it over. Pheasant raised his hand, like he was in school. But that doesn't kill him though. So he's just going to eat himself, then get healed and do it all over again? What if the healer is really good and he doesn't die? Or if they're bad and he shocks out and dies first go? We're putting a lot of thought into these torture plans, observed Indra, who took a voluntary sip to hide his smirk. I'm not so sure if I feel like letting anyone else take a watch tonight. Or any night, really. You have to sleep sometime, said Raven. I'll just steal all your soldier pills and survive off those. Your heart would explode, observed Beetle. I can live through that. Maybe. If his Naruto could walk off getting impaled, he could too. Even after a lifetime and 30 years of marriage, Indra refused to accept that he couldn't match Naruto when it mattered. If getting impaled mattered, then so be it. Otsutsuki arrows didn't count. When he hadn't raised his can, this left Cat the only one against Beetle's idea after Pheasant withdrew his objection and they turned away as the likely Akimichi drank what had to be half the kin in one swallow. Show off. He left his mask askew so they could see his dark-skinned, stubbly grin before he pulled it back on completely. Raven's next, and Cat's last, because she started all this. Are the big burly men going to gang up on me? Cat put her hands to her mask in an exaggerated scream posture and twisted into something that might have been a cowering pose if you squinted. Oh no, help. Oh, what is a lady to do when surrounded by such brutes? Save me, Indra-san. She launched herself at Indra, who decided a spilled drink was better than getting rammed by Cat and scrambled to catch her in his arm stump grasp. She went limp, forcing him to carry all of her weight, and he felt himself being driven to the ground with a groan. I have no idea how your boyfriend stands you, he muttered. Cat twisted around and launched off his shoulders to land primly back in her seated position by the fire as Indra's butt slammed into the unforgiving log. That was going to hurt tomorrow, but he idly grabbed his kin and looked to the masked figure. Now she's gotten that stupidity out of her system, what about you, Raven? Any suggestions for Orochimaru's fate? At this point I should have put a suggestion box in the Umbu HQ, we could have gotten creative. The cloaked figure shifted slightly as it sought a slightly less tough spot of rock, then spoke in a curiously androgynous voice. Get a list of all the experiments he's done on people and perform as many as possible until he's a quivering mound of flesh. Then, burn him. Pheasant shrugged while Indra raised his mostly spilled glass at Raven in a toast. I'll drink to that one just because it's a good idea. Suitably ironic, painful, has a clear end death state, yeah, I can't find anything wrong with it, said Beetle, and Cat nodded. So it looks like Raven won't have to show themselves after all. I'll drink, considering you all have been such good sports. Umbu rules, remember. They obligingly looked away, though he saw Cat's eyes roll sideways in the firelight as she tried to abuse what peripheral vision the masks provided, but it was apparently no use as her shoulders slumped. All right, came the voice, now it's Cat's turn. Well, I don't know if I can come up with dash. My clone's gone. Pheasant was on his feet, a kunao in hand, and the others jumped up as well, weapons leaping to hands as Beetle spat a stream of water down that smothered the fire instantly with a hiss of steam. Indra drew his sword in a reverse grip, blazing Sherry non-eye scanning the Trilene. Did you see anything? How it took you out? Nothing, just pain at the base of the neck, then gone. The 5 Umbu put their backs to the fire pit and closed ranks. In the time it took for their eyes to adjust to the darkness, they were vulnerable. Beetle's voice was low. Possible movement on my 1 o'clock. Raven was next. 3 o'clock, moving into your vision, Indra. Indra pushed more chakra into his eternal Mangekyo, but it was no use. The night vision capabilities of the Sharingan were minor, and all the chakra did was give him a slight headache. I've got nothing. All 5 of the Umbu were on guard, tense, wound up, even, but none of them panicked. That boded well for the raid, at least. Indra kept looking, but there was no movement, not even a glimmer of chakra. Whatever's out there has no chakra signature, totally invisible. Don't make assumptions, snapped Cat as something in the forest beyond her rustled. At least it didn't sound big, but that was a cold comfort. Something growled in the night and Indra frowned. That sound like a wolf to you? A pack of wolves? Are you kidding me? Exclaimed Pheasant. No assumptions. We know, Cat, now shut up. Beetle sounded frustrated and Indra didn't blame him. He saw 2 points of silvery white that might have been eyes in the underbrush and launched a kunao at it with 2 fingers while the rest kept a hold of his sword. They heard the thunk as the blade impacted wood and something moved away, circling them. A stalemate. Raven spoke up, with that curious voice that wasn't he. What jutsu would you possess to drive them out into the open, preferably without announcing our presence to the entire countryside? Ideas. Indra's gaze didn't break from the tree line. Fire gives us visibility, but the same problem. Lightning is too bright. If I had solid eye contact, a genjutsu would be easy, but whatever's out there isn't letting that happen. Same situation here, said Pheasant, throwing 4 shuriken and producing only shredded shrubbery. Our spilled drinks might work for a water jutsu, but that problem is range. Earth is too slow if the opponent is dodging ninja tools anyway. A wall for us, though, asked Indra. Announces us, like I said, grumbled Raven. Screw this, shouted Cat, flipping through hand signs. Wind style, wind scythe jutsu. A nearly invisible line of air rippled as it carved through the woods, cutting through the trunks of 3 trees in front of her without pause. Something snarled again and beat a hasty retreat, but there were other shapes out there in the dark. Indra made an executive decision. I'm pulling rank, we're leaving. Grab your things, we head north at speed. If you get picked off, make it loud and visible. If you get killed, kill it back and walk it off. Because they were a bunch of professional Umbu, it took them less than 5 seconds to sling packs onto their backs and leap for the trees. Indra silently wished someone had an owl summon or a spontaneously evolved visual jutsu that shot lasers from their eyes, and ran faster. Beetle had taken up the rear post, Indra the front, so he heard the man call out clearly in the silent night. They're following us, but sticking to the ground. We might be safe in the trees. He looked down and the Sharingan tracked ripples in the shrubbery as something accelerated up to match pace with 5 experienced Umbu. He shared this with the rest of the squad and they kept running north. In the end, they ran for the rest of the night without stopping and their pursuers followed them every step of the way. Still, none of the Umbu saw hide or hair of them, even when dawn slunk into the golden canopy of their surroundings. In fact, as the sun rose, the ripples in the brush trailed off until they simply ceased to exist. Pheasant was making wheezing noises through his mask and Raven missed a branch and nearly fell to the forest floor until Indra swooped down and threw the agent upwards. When their assailants disappeared in the morning light, they all nearly collapsed onto whatever object they were currently occupying, but nothing leaped up at them or crawled up the tree trunks. Cat took a long pull from her water bottle and for once, Indra didn't bother to look away. Okay, he admitted. 3 hours, then we move. I've got first watch, since it was my turn last night. Raven curled into a ball and faced away from the sun. If we just got chased 50 miles by a pack of wolves, I'm writing the daimyo to turn this forest into a strip mall. Their stalkers were back the next night, then the next. The 5 Umbu ran through every jutsu and trick in their arsenals. Chakra agitation and the Sharingan confirmed it wasn't genjutsu, and their map confirmed they were making real progress towards the land of the rice paddies. Dozens of techniques across all 5 elements failed to reveal their attackers or spill a single drop of blood. Just snarls and endless movement. Pheasant and Cat saw the silver-white eyes as well and the former almost caught one in a genjutsu, but whatever it was shook off his will with an unsettling squelching noise that absolutely didn't belong to wolves. By the 3rd night, Indra was done with subtlety and burned a circle of forest to empty, charred ground with the majestic destroyer flame and as night fell, ringed the area with Amaterasu's black flames for good measure. If nothing else, the flames kept them warm that night, but sleep was a fitful prospect at best. They were coming up on the border of the Land of Fire, 2 days away from Orochimaru's southern hideout, and they were not at their best. Ordinarily, Umbu could run for days, on little sleep, and fight no problem. That's why they were Umbu. But they were 2 days out from an encounter with an ex-Akatsuki member, and they couldn't afford to give Orochimaru even the smallest opening. Because he would use it to skewer them on Kusanagi and fashion a violin from their corpse, the sadistic bastard. That night, they heard more squelching noises than snarls, like something vast and slimy was crawling through mud, even though it hadn't rained in the last week. It was even creepier, and the Umbu did their best to not let the sound get to them. Psychological warfare like that would have required months to get them to snap. Probably. At 1.2 hours into his watch, Indra experimentally shoved a section of the black fire outwards, expanding the perfect circle into a lopsided oval. There was a great deal of squelching, then a wet, fleshy pop and the sound of several things sliding onto the grass. Indra focused and shoved the flames outward in all directions to a rapid crescendo of snarls, but there were no more pops that indicated any of the creatures had been caught in the flame. Indra drew his sword and elbowed the nearest dozing body, which happened to be Pheasant, who woke up with an inarticulate grunt and a swinging kunao. Indra's eye glowed above him, a red lighthouse against the dark stars. "I think I might have got one, let's go check it out." The ginger nodded and kicked at the Umbu agent to his right, which was Raven, and they walked off, swords naked in their hands and hearts pounding in their chests. They smelled it first, and Phoenix gagged. What is that? A 3-week-old corpse dumped in half a spice rack. It did smell like something had rotted, but oddly spicy, with a burn in Indra's nostrils that reminded him of Mist's irritant jutsu used for riot control. He'd smelled it before. When the sky opened up and the villages began to fall. When Kabuto's Edo Tensei resulted in black sludge, screaming, and madness. Otsutsuki, he hissed through clenched teeth and ran black lightning down his sword. Lightning chakra coated with the Amaterasu cut through alien flesh like few other forces could, but it hadn't always been a sure thing. "You read Briefing 3, he asked Pheasant, who nodded. If that's what this was, if Hag Oromo had failed, or was dead, and the Otsutsuki who'd followed him to the past was fucking with them, they were dead meat walking. They inched forward as Pheasant pulled out a small flashlight to supplement the flickering illumination Indra's sword created. Somehow, as he clutched the small object in his offhand, the Umbu agent drew strength from it. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay." Indra felt every drop of sweat as it poured down his neck, every gust of night air, every minuscule sound their feet made as they stepped on the burnt, packed earth. Then, they saw it. Something pale, naked, and hairless had indeed popped, and the shreds of skin lay glistening in the dirt. But as they watched, the skin that had covered the pulsating organs within was evaporating in the moonlight, vanishing into non-existence without a sound. Pheasant shoved his blade underneath the largest flap of skin that had likely been the creature's body and lifted it up, only to hear a hissing noise and the smell of spices as smoke rose from the blade. He dropped the weapon like it had burned him, and they watched in silent horror. The skin dissolved the blade into a small pool of liquid metal, and shards of alloy beneath it as it too vanished into moonlight. Pheasant seemed to be struggling to speak. "Look," Indra pointed with his sword, "the organs are still there." His companion gingerly picked up the remnant of his sword, and they carefully picked their way around the remaining pieces of white flesh. The organs lay in a loose pile, as if they'd been dropped from perhaps a foot or two off the ground and hadn't had time to scatter far. Some of them were still pulsating. Pheasant poked at one and it throbbed angrily in response, so he stabbed the thing and it had the mercy to die. Or at least, stop moving. He nodded and scraped the organ off in the grass. "Looks like only the skin is acidic. Defense mechanism." Indra stabbed the pile with his own sword, and something inside it made the same squelching noise they'd been hearing for the last 3 nights. They shifted through the pile using their swords, scattering each piece so they could test them individually, but whatever it had been, the squelching organ had stopped as well. Likely. Any of these organs look familiar. Even through the mask, he could feel the incredulous look Pheasant was shooting him. "I'm not a veterinarian, so no. You're the one who fought these things before, any advice?" They were keeping their voices low. Not quite a whisper, but something told them this was a subject best spoken about in hushed tones. Indra pointed with his sword at something fist-sized he'd shish kebabbed along with 2 other organs. Pretty sure that's a heart, and the secondary heart attached to it. Wouldn't keep it alive long term, usually just long enough for a suicide attack. The strike group had lost Kojuro's son that way, after he and Sasuke had ripped the heart out from one of the Otsutsuki, and the 8th Mizukage had died launching Sasuke away from the resulting blast radius. Indra punted the memory back into the depths of Sasuke's mind and focused on the impromptu dissection lesson. Some of them had this fleshy hood that allowed them to breathe in hostile environments. Gas, fumes, underwater, space. Pheasant mouthed the word space and his gaze strayed to the few remaining bits of flesh. If this thing had that, it's likely gone now. It didn't seem common. We only had 2 confirmed reports of it, one from my direct account, and that was under severe duress. The Susanoo did not allow an Uchiha to breathe in space. What did you fin, Holy Mother? Yeah, said Pheasant in a weak voice to Raven. Don't breathe through your nose. I can still taste it. There was a scuffling noise and a retching sound behind them as Indra rolled some of the other organs around. At least now they'd stopped moving. He narrowed his eye, allowing the Sharingan to look for any chakra remnants, but there was nothing. No chakra systems, like we thought. Wild animals, non-humanoid. So you've seen these before? The Uchiha shook his head, feeling every hour of missing sleep collapse onto his shoulders at once. No. The heart's the only thing I recognize, and that's because I ripped one out with a Chidori once. The disappearing acid skin is new, and look, there's no bones. Pretty sure the guys I fought had bones. Raven's altered voice was difficult to parse, but he knew the figure was skeptical. Pretty sure. Indra punted the heart into Amaterasu's flames and it made him feel only slightly better, so he kept doing it with the rest of the organs. I kicked them, something broke. Every time we tried to get a corpse to dissect, every Otsutsuki came barreling after the guilty party like a sand ninja goes after desert chicken. Vivisection. Indra let out a hollow-sounding laugh. It was hard enough killing them as it was. At least whatever had these, he launched the last gelatinous mass into the flames, could be killed by Amaterasu. Popped like a balloon from the sound of it. The flames, which are the result of a dangerous and forbidden Uchiha bloodline technique that only 3 people in the world can possibly create. Yes. Raven let out a string of quiet, but vehement curse words, and Indra sympathized. Even for a root agent, something this strange was getting an emotional reaction out of him, so the creep factor was off the charts. Say nothing to the others. Indra spun on his heels to stare straight into the beaked mask. We know they can be killed now, we know they exist and aren't just an elaborate jutsu. We know of something that can kill them, isn't that the most important part? We also have no remaining physical evidence, unless you kill another one. The information without physical proof will prove distracting and psychologically detrimental in battle. Indra shoved at the fire again, but the creatures were evidently keeping well away from the wall of black fire now, if they were still around them at all. He couldn't hear any more sucking noises, which was a blessing. I'm sure ignorance will be a blessing when they can't figure out what's killing them, he replied acidly. Raven bowed. No one has died yet, perhaps they serve some purpose beyond assault. A hunter beating a bush to drive prey into the archer's sights. Archer's sights. Indra dove to the ground as the realization hit him, and Raven was close behind him. What is it? They hissed. The one who came after me before, who shot my eye out, was an archer. And I created a huge open field with infinite sight lines 8 hours ago. We're sitting ducks. Raven actually cocked their head as they considered the idea, and for a moment Indra had the urge to laugh. Whoever was behind that mask was a very good actor. Again, we haven't died yet when the enemy has had hours to do so. Perhaps the ambush is ahead of us and these creatures are meant to drive us into it. Still think we should say nothing. We'll tell them there is a possibility of a long-range archer ambushing us within the next 2 days. And we came up with this, how? I believe Kidomaru of the Sound 5 fits the profile. You had this realization standing in this empty field, as you did just now. Indra thought and was almost surprised to remember that the spider mimic did in fact fit the profile, which in turn led again to Orochimaru. Perhaps Orochimaru had found the weakened, dying Atsutsuki and harvested his DNA to create these abominations. Perhaps they were working together to kill him. Perhaps Orochimaru had now retired to live among the peaceful Moon Society descendant branch of the Atsutsuki clan. But it would not do to speculate. Fine. But you have to explain why Pheasant will drink every single item with alcoholic content in our possession, so that's on you. Including the rubbing alcohol. Pheasant is a seasoned and experienced Umbu agent, not a third-rate Chunin who just got dumped. Indra threw up his arms in frustration as he stalked back to the camp. Trust me, he absolutely will. When they were ready to depart the next morning, Indra slowly lowered the walls of Amaterasu before he extinguished them altogether. Kat silently handed him a tissue as his eye wept blood. Does that always happen? She asked softly, so only he could hear. Regularly during my divorce. Beetle sniggered, because he'd been a lucky bastard and gotten a good night's sleep. The others determinedly ignored him. The Umbu squad ran all day and only stopped at an abandoned village when the heavens opened up in the late evening. The stone walls and patchy roofs provided some shelter, so it was adequate for the time. Indra put up the protective Amaterasu circle, and attempted to create a roof of the stuff to incinerate the rain, but it just turned their little outpost into a sauna. For that he was assigned first watch. That night, there was no rustling of grass, no snarls, barks, or squelching noises. Only the rain. The part of Indra that sounded a lot like his Naruto said it was likely that his flame control the day before had scared the creatures off. Indra reminded himself that despite his position of Hokage, his Naruto had been an Yuzure Tonkeki and had absolutely nothing useful to say about star-spawned whatever the fuck they were. He might have tried to eat it. Pheasant was now murmuring in his sleep, when he'd been silent before. A potentially lethal trait for an Umbu agent, but under the circumstances, Indra didn't blame him. He wondered if taking a co-worker in Umbu to get absolutely shit-faced was against the rules of his parental advice books. It probably was. Their final day of travel dawned bright and early with an absolutely stunning sunrise to make up for the sudden chill in the air. Indra dug through his pack searching for a second layer to put on under his cloak and found a dark green pouch stuffed into the side of the bag. It was the same color as the canvas, so a casual glance had missed it several times over. He turned it over in his hands, but it was neatly wrapped in a thick paper, the edges covered in clear tape. That meant this wasn't Naruto's doing, though he was the most likely culprit. Even with experience and multiple chakra arms, he couldn't wrap presents at all, which always made Sakura and Sasuke inexplicably happy whenever he'd given them gifts. He saw something glint and tilted the paper as ink in a neat hand was illuminated by the sunlight now streaming through the trees. Stay warm, it commanded. The single scribbly heart and the large smiley face said who the other two gift givers were, and Indra was absolutely not going to cry in front of seasoned Umbu operatives before a mission. He wasn't. He compromised by letting the loud sound of torn wrapping paper cover the small noise he made and discarded the paper to discover a scarf. It wasn't blue, orange, or even pink, but instead the same lavender purple of his kimono. The same formal kimono he'd worn to the Harano household. Well, he said to Kat's questions, as he began wrapping it around his neck, my wife always used to say I'd made purple into a good color just by wearing it. Chapter 27, Operation Harmony PT-1, Fangs for the Memories. Among shinobi of all nations, there were unspoken customs you learned along the way. Plenty of people shouted the names of their attacks, from New Genin to the Tsuchikage. Shinobi who wrote things on their flak jackets were destined to die an early death. There was no wrong way to wear a headband if the village symbol showed up somewhere on your person. And most importantly, the longer your hair, the more dangerous you were. Most shinobi cut it close or kept it to shoulder length. Any longer ran the risk of it getting set on fire, grabbed as an impromptu and painful grappling hook, or just getting a close cut from a volley of shuriken. However, some shinobi adamantly refused to allow anything like common sense to dictate their style and allowed their hair to grow long. Most of them died. The ones who didn't die kept their long hair as something of a taunt. It said, I am such an exceptional shinobi, I can afford an obvious weakness like long hair. I am such an exceptional shinobi, this hair has never been cut by an enemy blade. I am such an exceptional shinobi because I am better than you in every possible way, including my sense of style. After the Fourth Great Ninja War, Indra had been sure that Madara and Hashirama had started the trend entirely on their own, and it had grown, literally, from there. All three of the Sannin? Long hair. The third Tsuchikage and the fifth Mizukage? Long hair. Half of Nagato's corpse puppets. Long hair. Deidara, who had a very high opinion of his art. Long hair. And look at where he'd ended up twice now. Dead and beaten to a pulp, respectively. An example of someone who wasn't ready for long hair, proving the theorem with his demise. Case closed. So Indra felt perfectly safe wearing a long scarf that draped over his shoulder by a solid foot. He could manage. Besides, if anyone harmed a thread of his wonderful lavender scarf, well, that was all the motivation he needed to beat the stuffing out of them. The moment they crossed the border into the land of rice paddies, designated only by a small fence alongside the road, every one of the Umbu felt an invisible weight lift from their shoulders. They began to run faster, leap farther, and Beetle let out a very un-Umbu guffaw as they passed over the reflective pool of rice fields. Cat began to sing something that was half marching song and half nursery rhyme. The very air and sunlight felt stronger, more real, better in some way, as it filled a hole none of them had realized they were missing. Indra glanced over to see Raven inscrutable as usual, while Pheasant started snapping his fingers along with Cat's song. Wow, if I got Indra-san to smile, maybe I should quit Umbu and become a singer instead. Huh. You were smiling at me, right? Indra wasn't aware he was smiling until his hand traced the contours of his face. A full open-mouthed smile showing teeth. He was lucky Cat hadn't started screaming in horror. Ah, he's gone already. Can we get cheery Indra-san back? Actually, I think we should stop. He held up a hand and the shinobi dropped down to land next to a road sign, a variety of arrows indicating roads which stretched all across the land of rice paddies. Passing farmers and merchants looked curiously at them, as they removed their masks at Indra's gesture. They looked at each other's faces for the first time since the mission had begun. Beetle's red hair and cleft chin marked him as an Akimichi, and he had a thick scar across his left cheek that had been stapled together. Cat's purple hair fell around her elfin face in a way that made a passing farmer stare so long he walked into the fence and toppled over it. Raven, unsurprisingly, kept their mask and cloak on while. Amaterasu Okamai, divine goddess, and mother to us all, Indra chanted as he set his eyes upon Pheasant's face. Protect this man from harm and give me the wisdom and the blind luck necessary to keep him alive today. Beautiful goddess who cannot fail, bring light to these blinded eyes, so that we may see your glory once more. Come tend to the broken, shining sun, for these are your children. Come paint the gardens again. Pheasant was short because he was not a man. Pheasant was a teenager. With the given track record of teenagers in Umbu, that would have been bad enough, thanks Atake. But Pheasant was, specifically, a Yamanaka teenager Indra recognized from a root file stamped deceased. Pheasant was Fu Yamanaka. Fu Yamanaka had been in the Konoha records as a stillbirth. Sai had mentioned it during his wedding speech and Ino had flung the mic off stage as the ex-root members of the audience applauded politely while everyone else sank in their chairs. Fu Yamanaka was alive and was on the most dangerous mass Umbu action in the last 10 years. Indra felt what little blood there was in his face drain away. Inoichi was going to kill him. Much later, when sewing up Cat's arm, Indra would learn his shocked frozen silence lasted only 2 seconds of subjective time, and had barely been noticed, but right then it felt like an eternity. He blinked as the portion of his brain not screaming at him about the Yamanaka was screaming at him about something else. Something that was a much more active danger. Do you want the good news or the bad news first? He asked the assembled group. Pheasant Fu Yamanaka crossed his arms in a manner that suggested, get on with it. Bad news is, whatever weird shit that's been happening for the past few days now has us overcompensating and now we're going to be psychologically unbalanced for a major fight. Unless anyone here can suck out the memories of the last 3 days, we're stuck with them. Pheasant Yamanaka didn't raise his hand, but it did twitch. Beetle yawned. We're Umbu, psychological imbalance is a coping mechanism, so what's the good news? The good news is, I'm pretty sure the weird shit left us behind when we left the land of fire and our return journey will be re-entering all the way down from T country, so whatever it was, it will have a harder time finding us. Assuming those things aren't tracking us some other way, said Raven. Point taken, so we dash. Excuse me, said a thin, halting voice from behind them. The squad turned as one to see a man in plain brown work clothes holding a hoe in front of him with a defensive stance. You lot wouldn't happen to be shinobi, would you? No, lied Beetle, these fine nobles are on a drinking tour of the minor nations and I'm the idiot who got signed to escort them. Cat let out a girlish giggle and playfully shoved at the massive man, who didn't budge an inch. Oh, Anoka-san, you're so funny. Indra and Pheasant joined in the laughter, but the man's skeptical expression meant they weren't fooling anyone. They really should have come up with more than a paper-thin disguise for the locals, but no one had given it serious thought when the whole point of their group was to be the noisy bait for Orochimaru. And what about that one? Asked the farmer, pointing at the still-hidden Raven. Oh, him, said Pheasant, he's a Fugu monk we found in the mountains of Lightning Country who's taken a vow to hide from the world. He was so interesting we decided to drag him along with us. Raven inclined their head to indicate this was so. Well, whoever you are, I heard you lot talkin' about some critters chasin' you and wondered if you knew any more than the rest of us. Is it some village thing? With those chakra critters you summon? The Umbu exchanged looks and Indra stepped forward. Has something happened here recently? The farmer snorted and offered his hand. I'm Goro, who are you lot? Pleasantries first, like civilized men. I'm Indra Uchiha, this is Nezumi, Fu, and the big man is Son Goku. We just call him Monk. The farmer nodded and out of the corner of his eye Indra saw Pheasant twitch again at the sound of his true name. Well, there's been some queer events the last week or so, has the townsfolk up in arms. We sent word to those Sound Village fellows the daimyo hired a few years back and they came to check it out, then disappeared again. Didn't help much either. Crops burnt up, dead animals, a few houses broken into. At first we thought it was some kids or those Sound ninja messing with us, but something ate 2 cows down to the bone. He shuddered and grasped his hoe tighter. If you lot are here to sort it out, we can't pay you, but we'll put in a good word with the headman and he'll try getting the daimyo a bit more of your business. Indra felt Cat's hand brush up against his thigh out of sight and make a quick series of hand signs. Nice to know they were on the same page at least. Well, seeing as how we're not ninja, we can't help you, he said, putting on a snobbish air. But I'm sure that with our superior noble education and Son Goku's skills, we can put this to rights. Seeing as how we've drunk up so much sake these last few months it seems only fair, don't you think? The others made varying noises of assent and even Raven nodded their head. The farmer Goro's weathered face broke into a cautious smile. Well, I'll lead the way then. Not much work getting done out in the fields solo during autumn. The group followed Goro down the road for a few miles, making horrible time by Umbu standards, but they took the time to investigate what they could. Cat, Indra, and Pheasant played the part of wild and irresponsible nobles while Raven and Beetle maintained a veneer of dignity and intimidation. There were trails burnt through fields of mostly empty rice stalks and the water within the pools had an iridescent sheen Indra didn't like the look of. They'd tested it and found no oil or increased acidity, but it was something, indeed. Goro pointed them to outlying houses that had been broken into, left riddled with wolf-sized holes. Smaller than most humans, but big enough several could take down an armed spearman with little difficulty. Even though the families of the houses provided their accounts, none of the peasants had gotten a clear view of one of the creatures either, for they always managed to remain just out of view. One particularly brave man had thrown an axe at the retreating trails in his rice field and hit something that caused snarls and more squelching noises. However, when he'd gone with his sons to investigate the next morning, they'd found the axe abandoned in the water, the blade mostly melted and bite marks on the handle where the creatures had pulled it out. He offered them the handle and the nobles who absolutely weren't ninja bent to examine it. Beetle pointed at the spacing. Way too big to be a wolf, right? They're a handbreadth across, this is twice that. Pheasant picked it up and examined the teeth marks closely. Mostly jagged, tearing strikes on the wood, so they're carnivorous for sure. No molars or grinding marks. He turned back to Goro, who'd gathered behind them with a small crowd of the curious, skeptical, and slightly afraid. Do you still have that dead cow? The farmer shook his head and one of the men behind him muttered a prayer. We burnt that right quick. Bad for the gods, bad for the other animals, bad for the earth. Indra couldn't agree more as he sat back on his haunches. Well, from what we can tell, your suspicions were correct, Goro-san. This isn't any natural creature, so we'll inquire at the Sound Village on our way to our next destination. I heard their Otokage has a reputation as a man who enjoys a good drink. If we hear more, we'll send word to you, on my honor. Goro leaned on his hoe and looked skeptical, but gratified the people with money were at least interested enough to do something. Thank you very much, Uchiha-san. Your kindness is much appreciated. Indra waved a hand in a magnanimous gesture. Nonsense, it's the least we can do for you. Damn right it is, someone in the crowd muttered, but they pretended not to hear them. Well, what's this? A new voice rang out and the crowd of villagers parted to reveal a trio of men in the black and purple uniform of the Sound Village's Chunin. Two had their features concealed by black hoods that hid everything but their eyes, while the leader's face was visible and painfully recognizable to Indra. He grinned and strode forward to offer his hand to the man. Roken Sabato, how the hells are you? The man and his subordinates looked bewildered, but Indra intended to keep them on the back foot for as long as possible. If there was to be a fight, he was going to get them all away from the villagers first. Mostly because it was what his Naruto would want him to do, but also because these people were also being victimized by creatures, and if the Sound Ninja knew anything at all about it, they also might have a solution. The man looked bewildered but recovered quickly and grasped his hand in a firm shake. I'm afraid you have the advantage of me, friend. You know me, but I don't know you. Indra laughed and released the man, letting his arm drop back in a hand sign for his comrades to stand down for the moment, but he could feel them quivering like plucked bowstrings behind him. Of course you wouldn't. We met in the Land of Wind, during that bar fight, remember? He was drawing on memories of the man when he'd been Sasuke's subordinate in the Sound Village, in the aftermath of that nasty retrieval mission where he'd gone after his pregnant lover and Sasuke had been sent to bring them both in. They'd shared 2 bottles of sake in the underground bar Orochimaru allowed to exist for his ninja's entertainment, and most of the man's drunken utterances were now the outlines of Indra's supposed friendship. That bar fight was what had put the man on the path towards the Sound Village in the first place. With a start, Indra realized Roken was now roughly the same age as he was instead of 10 years his senior. Bizarre. They reminisced briefly about the horrible bars but wonderful people the Land of Wind had to offer until Roken seemed to accept whoever these people were. They were less likely to gut him within the next 60 seconds, and he too motioned his men to stand down. So, you say you're touring the minor nations in search of better drinks? Indra shrugged. Nezumi and Fu behind me insisted we find one last party before we marry and have to become respectable members of society, so here we are. And now we've found ourselves a curious little local mystery in the bargain. Pheasant held out the axe handle and Roken accepted it with a nod of thanks. Well, we've been sent to figure it out too. Lord Orochimaru, the Otokage, may the winds favor his harvests, prepared this repellent he assured us will work. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a sealed jar with greenish-gray sand inside. My subordinates have additional jars and we intend to spread it around the village and in the areas these creatures were sighted, which should drive them off. Something about the smell, apparently. Cat made an interested noise and floated up to lean on Indra's good shoulder. Well, this Lord Orochimaru sounds like such an interesting person, we'd love to meet him. Roken looked apprehensive. I'm not sure that's the best idea at the moment, ma'am. And I don't have the authority to dash. I sent word ahead a month or so ago, said Indra, making a gamble. I told Lord Orochimaru to expect us and that he should break out the quality wine for his favorite guest. At that, Roken's expression vaulted from nervousness all the way into sheer terror as he looked Indra up and down again, taking in the black hair, bandage-wrapped face, and single visible arm. Indra gave a little smile and patted him on the shoulder. Like I said, we're old friends. Roken handed his jar of repellent back to his subordinate as his eyes roamed over the other members of their group, lingering longest on Raven's ominous cloaked and hooded form. His voice was faint. You two, spread the repellent as we were instructed. I'll bring these guests to Lord Orochimaru at once. Is the village far, whined Pheasant? We've been walking so long already, and I'd like to rest. You were the one who didn't want to pay for a carriage, muttered Beetle in a brilliant bit of improvisation. Still committed to the disguises, bless the professionalism of the Umbu. Roken shuffled a little as he debated turning his back on Indra's group, but finally did so to address the farmers. As I said before, my fine fellows, Lord Orochimaru is thankful for the contributions you have made to the Sound Village and is committed to protecting the people of this land. If our repellent works as we hope it does, he will be having an audience with the daimyo in 2 months, if your headman wishes to pay his respects. There was some murmuring and a few appreciative claps, but the mood of the crowd was uncertain. They may have only been farmers and peasants, but the Sound Village hadn't done much before this to endear itself to them. It was almost a shame the Leaf Ninja weren't going to give them the chance to earn the village's trust. Almost. Roken turned back and met Indra's eye. Purely to be petty, Indra flashed his Sharingan at the man, who gulped. "Follow me then," he said and sprang away. The Umbu set out at something between a brisk walk and a run until they were out of the villager's sight, whereupon they pushed Chakra into their leg muscles and caught up with the Sound Chunin, leaving him in front as they donned their masks again. Cat winked at the man to put him at ease, but they all knew it was a false sense of comfort. He'd seen their faces, so his chances of survival went from unlikely to vanishingly small. "Don't worry about it," she chirped. "We'll be civilized about this, so no need to do something stupid like attacking us." Roken agreed and Indra sent a silent apology his direction. He'd hoped the man would be captured, but when compared to the stakes of the mission they were on, he wasn't going to beat himself up over the corpse of a subordinate 40 years distant. He had been the first subordinate to die on him back then as well, courtesy of Orochimaru's idea of corrective punishment. A reminder then and now, to not get too attached. Soon enough the other 2 Sound Ninja approached from behind them as the sun began to climb down from its position high in the sky. It was past noon, thanks to the terrible time they'd made with their little detour to the farmer's village, but they should still make it to the Sound Village before sundown. Roken's subordinates hung back upon seeing their leader surrounded by the now unmistakable cloaked figures of Umbu Black Ops, but Raven and Pheasant fell back and soon corralled them up to run next to their leader as meat shields. The silence among them was oppressive, so of course Cat broke it. "So what's the deal with these creatures, Sabato? The snake have a jailbreak or is this some fucked up field test?" The Chunin cast her a fearful look and clamped his mouth shut. "Oh, come on, they chased us for 3 days through the land of fire then broke off once we hit your neighborhood. We wanna know." Roken's surprise confirmed that this hadn't been on purpose. Or if it was, he hadn't been told about it. "By the wind, they've already spread that far." He ran a hand through his short brown hair as his subordinates gasped in horror as well. "If they're giving even Umbu trouble, then what are we supposed to do?" "I didn't say they were giving us trouble," said Cat waspishly. "Just that they chased us." A muscle clenched in the Sound Chunin's jaw but he responded. "Did any of you kill one?" Beetle and Raven answered at the same time, the no and yes overlapping. Heads swiveled to the hooded Umbu and Indra resisted the urge to set the figure on fire. They were playing games with him and he hated it. Roken gaped at Raven but swallowed his awe. "So you know what they look like then," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Another one of Orochimaru's experiments gone right, no doubt," said Beetle with anger in his voice. Roken looked torn but nodded. "Probably, but at least he sent us out with that repellent, so the Otokage hasn't abandoned the villagers yet. He needs them to provide the village with food and is using them as his guinea pigs," spat Indra, remembering Naruto's distaste for that title. "That's sociopathy, not the sign of a cage. His pretensions taint the role itself. He's taken us in, when he didn't have to," argued one of the masked subordinates, a naive statement which was greeted with the disgusted silence it deserved. The man shrank into himself and said nothing more. Soon enough they reached the forest which held the main hideout in the late afternoon. The thick canopy permitted only the weakest sunbeams through and the entire area was shrouded in shadow. There was no sound of animal life common in a forest, from the small rodents or rabbits in the brush to the presence of boars, or even unchallenged predators like wolves or the occasional bear. Even the insects had fled from the place. It was the same way when Sasuke had arrived at the hideout decades before, as the obscene experiments below contaminated the very soil with misery, fear, and cruelty. Ideally, they would have to hire a priest to bless the area when their bloody work was done. But the blue-roofed gateway down into the earth, topped by snake carvings, was in sight. Behind him Pheasant let out a noise that could easily be mistaken for a bird call and received several others in return. The first wave of Umbu Orochimaru would be expecting were there already. Good. Both the Leaf and Sound had several months to plan for this day, even if they didn't know the exact timing and had prepared strategies accordingly. These acid-fleshed creatures were a wrinkle, but that's why Danzo had insisted on majority Umbu squads. When the shit hit the fan, this would change from a game of calculated tactical go moves to speed shogi. Instantaneous judgments would force errors on both sides, which would require faster and faster responses as the number of combatants increased and corpses began to pile up. Their 3 hostages jerked in surprise as a lavender blur sped past them in midair, directly in front of the Umbu, and as the group landed on the grass in defensive crouches, the 3 Sound Ninja collapsed to the ground. One of the masked men was clutching at his throat, trying in vain to stem the blood, and Indra ended the man's suffering with a thrust of his blade. You didn't have to go to the effort, Indra Uchiha. It would have been rude of me to inconvenience our guests. The blur resolved itself into a tall pale teenager with long white hair, an open-chested lavender Haori and sea-green eyes surrounded by red paint. His expression was calm, untroubled by the spray of arterial blood that sliced across his face, and he wiped it away with one hand as the white blade he'd used disappeared into his sleeve. He offered a short bow and gestured in the direction of the tunnel. Lord Orochimaru has been expecting you, so allow me to show you the way. Indra looked back and saw the Umbu behind him. Cat was the only one he could truly call a comrade, but he saw every one of them nod and tighten their grips on the various swords or kunao in their hands. Into the belly of the beast, then. Indra turned back to see Orochimaru's executioner waiting patiently. Very well. Lead on. The Sound Village's headquarters in the land of rice paddies was vast, stretching for several miles of tunnels that intersected, sloped down or up, twisted and turned in a way that made them nearly impossible for an enemy to navigate swiftly. Secret passages were used to direct Sound Ninja to contain any invaders, but mostly their targets were prisoners using their experimental abilities to attempt an escape. The boy led them deeper and deeper into the tunnels, and at each junction they passed, Indra crossed off 1 or 2 more meeting rooms from his list. He'd lived here for years after all, and knew most of the system as well as any Sound Ninja, for he'd once spent 3 days wandering its halls with an active Sharingan, mapping it out, just in case he'd had to flee. A lifetime later, his caution had paid dividends. Ordinarily, a small invading force heading underground, into enemy territory, with hundreds of enemy shinobi hidden around was a death sentence. But because of Indra's maps, they were on an even footing. If Orochimaru sought to trap them, he was in for several surprises. They heard distant screams, the murmur of conversations behind closed doors, and 2 Sound Genin flattened themselves against the walls when they saw Indra's little procession. Kikimimaro-san, one of them sputtered, and the pale teenager paused to ruffle the girl's hair and give her a small smile. It's no problem, kin. Lord Orochimaru's been expecting them. You head down and see if Isho has any leftovers from lunch. The girl smiled, stuck her tongue out at Indra and ran down the hall. He felt, more than saw, the Umbu behind him turn their heads to follow her movement, but Indra kept his eye fixed on the teenager in front of him. With Kabuto out of the way, and Orochimaru next on the chopping block, Kimimaro Kagaya was easily the most dangerous person in the Sound Village. He'd heard quite a bit about the man from Yugo, and during the initial few months of Sasuke's arrival, many Sound Ninja had scorned him as a poor replacement for Kimimaro. To lose a kind boy with terrifying power and loyalty to Orochimaru to gain a surly, glaring Sasuke Uchiha, many of them felt it had been a poor trade. From that brief exchange, Indra was inclined to agree with them, purely on principle. Kindness was a rare commodity in the Sound Village, but it was there. Of course, as the 3 corpses on the surface testified, kindness was relative. Beetle spoke up. Kimimaro of the Kagaya clan, huh? Lots of legends about you in the Mist Village these days. Legends doubtless amplified in the telling, said the boy softly but with scorn. I defended Lord Orochimaru and myself, nothing more. Indra silently hoped that, defending Orochimaru, did not include the piercing ashen bones technique Kagaya Atsutsuki had employed. It had turned Obito to dust, and from the moment the bone pierced the body, death was certain. Even with his skills and several Umbu backing him up, Indra did not want to deal with that again. They turned right and down a flight of steps as the tunnel opened up to become a vast two-laned causeway which led to the largest space in the Sound Village, the prison yard. Buried deep beneath the ground, the area was 2 stories high and surrounded by jail cells that held prisoners either by clan, by nation, by blood type, or some other esoteric means. Orochimaru's needs for his next experiment changed rapidly and the disoriented prisoners were often shuffled around, as much to prevent organization and escape attempts as anything else. The reinforced steel doors opened to reveal a deserted stone space, surrounded by dozens of cells, their doors wide open and gaping, seeking fresh new bodies to fill them. In the center of the room were a series of chairs grouped around a wooden table, beyond which sat the very man they had come so far to find. "Lord Orochimaru," announced Kimimaro, his voice ringing in the vast space, "Indra Uchiha and his bodyguards are here to see you." He turned back to the group, who still stood, clutching their weapons in tight grips. "I'm afraid you will leave your weapons inside their sheaths for the duration of this meeting. Otherwise, we shall have to disagree and that could make things unpleasant for all of us." Indra snorted and sheathed his sword at his hip as the others followed with varying degrees of caution, save for Kat. Kimimaro stepped closer to her, his hand disappearing up his voluminous sleeve while his eyes sought hers beyond the mask. "I insist." Indra turned slightly to put Kat into his peripheral vision. "It'll be fine, Kat." "Right up until it's not," she muttered and sheathed her short sword in a manner that suggested she wanted to find other places to bury it. Now, came the silken voice of Orochimaru, "let's not spoil such an interesting meeting before it's even begun. After all, we have so much to talk about." He beckoned and Indra moved forward to take the center seat as the Umbu fanned out around him. Kat was on his blind side, followed by Raven, with Beetle and Pheasant on the other. Kimimaro bent behind Orochimaru's chair and produced several clear, thin glasses which he distributed as well as a large dark bottle. Indra raised his one visible eyebrow as Orochimaru smiled. "You did warn me to break out the quality wine, and I thought it best to honor such an auspicious guest. As my reputation precedes me, I thought a gesture of trust was in order." He held the bottle out and Indra could see the paper seal above the cork was unbroken. The bottle had not been tampered with, so Indra nodded. He'd been metaphorical when he'd spoken to Kabuto, but if Orochimaru wanted this, he could play along. "I'll have a glass, then." "Out of curiosity, what is the vintage?" Orochimaru handed the bottle to Kimimaro, who extruded a corkscrew-shaped bone from his fingertip and proceeded to open the bottle with a satisfying pop of a releasing seal. The boy poured 2 glasses and placed the bottle back on the table as Orochimaru named the vineyard and year and Indra nearly smiled at the irony. It was the same bottle of wine Orochimaru had given him on his 15th birthday, all those years ago. The day just kept resonating in strange ways. He raised his glass. "I propose a toast then, to fate, which has brought us together. To fate, which allowed you to survive the massacre of your clan." Orochimaru raised his glass and tapped it gently against Indra's and both men drank deeply. "I must say, I am most curious to hear how you survived Deer Attacketh at night, especially since you've been impressively absent these last few years. I had my people go through a great many records, but they couldn't find an Indra Uchiha anywhere or even someone fitting your description. So where did Dear Danzo hide you away in the meantime?" "Oh, I hid myself, mostly. It took some doing, but I learned all about the organization you and Itaka joined and had the most disappointing encounter with their leader this year. I'm sure your spies heard about that. Which reminds me," Indra plastered a look of fake concern on his face, "how is Kabuto? He ran off so quickly, and he seemed like such a smart shinobi. I was hoping to speak with him further." Orochimaru sipped from his wine glass to conceal his irritation, if not his anger. "You'd know better than I, Indra Uchiha. Considering you managed to burn him alive from hundreds of miles away. The Sharingan is always full of surprises, isn't it?" Beetle, Raven and Pheasant shifted in their seats and he could feel them looking at him curiously through their masks. Indra allowed himself a typical Uchiha smirk, the kind Orochimaru would take as a measure of overconfidence. "It is, even for the Uchiha clan's bloodline enforcer, which is why I was so disappointed to hear my half-brother had run off with the clan's scrolls on Sharingan variations. He wouldn't have happened to show them to you, did he? Secrets from one murdering sociopath to another? The Akatsuki sounds like such a friendly organization. But the Rinnegan, Now I think that's much more interesting. Later, Kat would swear she saw Orochimaru begin to drool slightly, and in the moment, Indra agreed with her. The snake's hunger became a physical thing, flowing from him to engulf the Umbu in waves of desire and greed. All throughout, he retained that same half-smile, while those golden eyes retained that mix of cruelty and mockery. Indra couldn't wait to impale that face. At last, we get to your generous offer. How you know of my interest in that eye is also something I intend to pry out of you. Where did you come by such knowledge? Indra swallowed the last of his wine and placed the empty glass back on the table. Well, an eye that could see the future tends to be quite helpful. Such a shame Madara Uchiha took it out of my head when I tried to stop him from cracking our world like an egg. He sat back and watched as the naked shock blasted past the false amiability Orochimaru had tried to project. Surprise. Disbelief. Consideration. Suspicion. That hunger, to acquire, to create, but above all to know. The Sannin bared his teeth and hissed at him, hands clenched on the throne. The Umbu's arms disappeared behind their backs as Kimimaro drew a bone blade from within his own arm. You lie. Orochimaru hissed. In all my research, the Sharingan has never shown such potential. Not even the legends of the Sage of Six Paths hint at such a thing. Indra tensed his leg muscles, ready to move if the Sannin decided to try something rash, like stealing his remaining eye, but the need for more information kept them alive. His voice was grim. As you're aware, the Mangekyo Sharingan's powers are varied, but they have their price to pay. And this one's price was dearly bought indeed. He didn't even want to think his daughter's name too loudly in a place like this, but it was the truth, in a roundabout sort of way. Of course, it comes with heavier burdens than blindness. You might have encountered one by chance, recently. Pale acidic skin, strange noises, difficult to kill? Ring any bells? Now it was his turn to fish for information. Your man was quite talkative before Kimimaro killed him. Apparently, the idea of their spread to the land of fire was sufficiently horrific to overcome his fear of punishment, so we're left to wonder exactly what it is you get up to here. A man who could create such creatures is not one I would trust with the sacred Rinnegan. Orochimaru sat back and leaned on his hand, staring at Indra for a long while in silence. He'd been quiet for so long Indra had suspected a covered body substitution, but the Sannin spoke once more. I'm beginning to think your knowledge makes you more dangerous than helpful, Indra-san. Now, tell me what your proposal is, and I will decide if you will retain your last precious eye. Here it was, the tipping point for not just Orochimaru, but the entire Sound Village. Indra took a deep breath and stepped off the cliff. You are the foremost expert on Hashirama cells in the 5 great nations. You cultured them, cultivated them, and implanted them into 60 children on Shimura Danzo's orders. Are you aware of the Akatsuki spy, Zetsu? Black and white plant man, rather obvious? Orochimaru nodded. Find him, capture him, seal him, imprison him in whatever ways you can, the black and the white separate if necessary. You will find the white one to be an artificial human, composed entirely of Hashirama cells. Clone him, and you will have all the bodies you will ever need. You will do this and you will relinquish your vengeance against the Hidden Leaf Village and your master, Hiruzen Sarutobi. If you do this, and are true to your word, I will give you a cellular sample of my eye, the fully matured Mangekyo Sharingan you have long desired. From there, it is a simple matter to unlock the Rinnegan, provided its custodian finds you worthy. If Hagoromo still lived, Indra was fairly sure he would never bequeath that eye's power to a creature like Orochimaru, though Indra would pay good money to hear that conversation. If Hagoromo was dead, then the idea was doomed anyway. Orochimaru listened in silence and then smiled. Indra had never let his guard drop, but that smile simply raised his suspicions to new levels. It had never, ever meant anything good. Orochimaru's voice was back to its sickly sweet tone, dripping with condescension. Such interesting ideas, from such an interesting shinobi. But a thought just occurred to me. Dear Ataka's eyes are beyond my reach, as are the eyes of the one called Pain. You only have one eye, one arm, and are in my fortress at this very moment. Why could I go to all that trouble for you, when you are already here, ripe for the taking? He rose to his feet and spread his arms wide to indicate their little group. And you've brought me such strong, Healthy test subjects too. I will enjoy seeing how long they last with cloned eyes in their heads. Indra remained seated, even as the Umbu around him likewise leapt into battle stances. He stared coldly up at Orochimaru and crossed one leg over the other, bringing it below the table in front of him. I would have thought burning your chief spy alive was a sufficient warning. Perhaps I'll need to remind you. He kicked up, sending the table, the glasses, and the wine bottle flying at Orochimaru, obscuring his sight. Instantly, Indra rolled to the side over the armrest as a blade extended through the table and swung down, carving both the table and chair in two. Indra had drawn his own sword and laced it with Amaterasu's black fire when he heard the clash of steel on steel as Cat and Raven launched themselves at Kimimaro, who had sprouted blades from what seemed like every square inch of his flesh. He heard a faint VMMM and flipped backwards as Orochimaru's extended Kusanagi blade swung sideways, passing over its extending reach as something impacted the spot he'd been standing with tremendous force. The concussive impact threw him back even further, but Indra turned the fall into a handspring and was soon upright with his own blade at the ready. Inside the crater was a massive golden arrow the size of a man, still quivering with the force it had been fired with. Tracing the arc of its fire backwards, past Orochimaru, who was performing his regurgitate the sword routine, he could see the far wall behind the snake sage had been blasted apart by some colossal force. 3 vast demonic figures charged from the hole, followed by 3 teenagers in the beige and purple ribbons of Orochimaru's elite. The Sound Ninja 5. His eye tracked movement behind the vast demons and another massive golden arrow drove across the space with such force the air around it screamed in protest. Indra ran forward, both to get inside Orochimaru's range and limit Kodomaru's sniping opportunities, but as he moved, the arrow shifted mid-flight along with him. The Sharingan's predictive qualities told him the arrow would bury itself right in his chest unless he did something, so he added lightning chakra to his own sword and braced for the hit. Chakra-hardened thread that could penetrate concrete collided with honed lightning chakra and a sword forged by samurai masters in the land of iron. Indra dug in his heels and poured chakra into his arm as the force of the arrow drove his sword and his arm back towards his chest. Even as the arrow crept closer, however, Amaterasu was already creeping along its length, devouring it entirely. He felt a furrow being ground into the concrete and saw the thin silk thread that led back to the multi-limbed archer, whose demonic face grinned at him and gave a cocky wave. So, the Sound 5 had cursed seals, then. That meant poor Yugo was here, as he'd feared. His eye bled once more as black fire bloomed into existence along Kodomaru's bow, but then Orochimaru was upon him. The stolen sword of the land of grass met Indra's own with a harsh screech and the crackle of chakra as Indra's lightning broke apart under Kusanaga's edge. Indra kicked out, but Orochimaru twisted around effortlessly to send his sword at Indra's neck from the opposite angle. His unarmed side was an obvious weakness, but Indra had trained and fought for decades this way and brought his sword up in a vertical guard, arm reaching over his head as his stump braced the back of his own blade. They strained against the deadlock, gauging the other's physical strength, then disengaged in a cloud of sparks. Orochimaru spun his sword in his hands with a needless flourish, always a showman. Or perhaps it was meant to intimidate. Either way, Indra wasn't impressed. You know, he called out as he pulled 2 kunai from his pouch and flung them up to spin in the air, I thought you would go for something a bit more dramatic. He kicked one at Orochimaru and stuck the other one to the underside of his foot with chakra as he leaped forward in a spinning blow he'd borrowed from Killer Bee. 5 teenagers aren't reinforcements. Orochimaru blocked and Indra kicked away the riposte with his kunai, allowing the blade to launch itself on a diagonal path that forced his opponent into a poor stance to avoid it hitting his own foot. Indra swung twice more while he was upside down and when neither of those blows got through, stabbed his sword into the ground to vault himself up and over Orochimaru. He landed, breathing hard as the demonic creatures behind him roared in pain and he heard Cat's shout of triumph. Orochimaru licked his lips and stabbed out several times, forcing Indra to dodge the extending blade once more as snakes nipped at his heels. Oh, they were never my reinforcements, Orochimaru crooned. These are. From every darkened cell came a rain of soft wet noises as bodies fell to the floor from somewhere else, followed by a cacophony of snarls as hundreds of white, fleshy creatures poured out of the cells, hungry for flesh. Chapter 28, Fire and Ice. To Indra's credit as a clairvoyant guardian, he had left Kakashi a small, but heavily annotated list of possible outcomes titled Just in Case, which the Jonin had read and then proceeded to have a small heart attack. The first one, in bold and underlined twice, was simple. In event of attack sighting, chain Sasuke to a tree and have Naruto and Sakura sit on him. Keep him there until I return. In comparison, the rest of them were almost normal. If people in Akatsuki robes show up, grab the children and run for the Hokage. If the Nine Tails escapes, use your Sharingan to stop it. If Naruto eats all the food by Wednesday, there is extra grocery money taped behind the clock in the kitchen. If there is an argument and none of them are speaking to one another, ask Inoichi Yamanaka for help. Fortunately for his sanity, the structure of the ninja academy meant the ninja in training were mostly occupied with classes or with training. He'd pitched in as their after-school instructor in the afternoons, and with all three of the little hellions attacking him with wooden weapons, it made for a satisfying training session. For him. Naruto and Sakura were vocally frustrated. His eyes never left the Ika Ika book in his hand, and Sasuke had been infuriated that not even Ataka's perfect Kunao deflection jutsu could touch him. Once or twice, he could have sworn that the boy's eyes were glowing red, but by the time he'd lifted his own headband to check, they were back to the solid black they normally were. When it came to ninjutsu training, he'd put all three of them through the leaf adhesion and wall walking exercises, but despite a few close calls, nobody had broken anything and remained simply bruised, sore, and grudgingly satisfied with their training. The more time they spent around him, however, the less respect he received. Maybe it was his habitual lateness, where they ended up walking one another to school. Maybe it was Indra's insistence he keep the lessons simple, which threw out most of his rudimentary lesson plans designed for new Anbu recruits. Maybe it was the fact he kept handing them their butts. Well, they hadn't even graduated the academy and he was an ex-Anbu. No, that wasn't it. They'd never glared this much at Kat, had they? However, it wasn't all training. He'd investigated, not snooped, investigated, Indra's room and found 4 parenting books absolutely crammed with small notes in Indra's cramped, slightly wobbly hand. Some of them made sense, most of them didn't. The section on parenting traumatized children was heavily annotated in blue ink, especially inability to form friendships, low self-esteem, and emotional regulation. Which were followed by Indra's notations, thanks Atake, and the last 2 were simply circled with an arrow pointing to the words divorce fallout. Kakashi practically flung the book back into Indra's nightstand as something approaching a feeling curled its way around his heart and squeezed. He searched for something else, anything else, and came up with a list of good childhood memories half buried underneath several other sheaves of paper. Excellent, something to steal from for ideas. It was empty. Somehow, that was worse. Unwilling to rifle through any more of Indra Uchiha's emotional detritus, Kakashi stepped away and brushed down his arms as if they were covered in dust. Time to use some of that lauded genius intellect on something that wasn't killing people. Alright, what did people do for fun? He mentally trawled through his Ika Ika collection in his mind. People went to restaurants, they watched movies, they went to hot springs, they met attractive strangers in coffee shops. Wait, no. They went shopping, they read books, they listened to music, they got drunk. Wait, no. The former Anbu sighed behind his mask. He'd been perfectly fine with constant missions as a child, and sure, his father's death had been tough, but Minato had been there, and there was a war going on anyway, so. His train of thought sped off into the distance as he tried to remember the rare moments with Minato and Kushina when they hadn't been training, on a mission, or recovering from the first 2. What had they done together? What could he pass down to their son, and to his friends? Kakashi. He turned on his heel to see a deeply skeptical Sasuke crossing his arms and looking like he was torn between 2 equally piercing questions. Kakashi spared him the trouble and held up the nearest piece of paper he could find, which unfortunately was the blank good childhood memories. Just looking to see if your uncle had any ideas for what we could do on Saturday, that's all. We can't train. Kakashi gave an exaggerated yawn and stretched his arms behind his head to surreptitiously drop the paper before Sasuke got a good look at it. Well, not that I don't enjoy kicking your butts around the dojo, but I figured we should try something different for a change. You know, get out and see a bit more of the village. And did he have any ideas? Kakashi's Anbu senses detected a test and his mind raced through his happy memories at lightning speed. He could introduce them to Might Guy, who would doubtless have several boisterous ideas for enjoying the springtime of youth, but that was also a bit too close to training for Kakashi's comfort. He also shuddered to think about exposing children to Guy would accomplish. If Indra came back to find any one of them wearing green jumpsuits, Kakashi was sure someone would lose their head. He realized he'd let the silence stretch for too long because Sasuke had let out a quiet sigh and turned to leave. I was thinking about a picnic. Kakashi's brain stuttered, threw itself into reverse, and then surged into motion once again. Where in the world had that come from? From what dark, repressed corner of his memory had? He remembered Kushina approaching their training ground through the trees, a basket on her arm and a blanket over her shoulder as he had watched Obito and Rin spar. The day before the mission to Konobe Bridge, when he'd told everyone he'd made Jonin. Before everything fell apart, there had been a picnic. In the tragedy of his life, Kakashi knew, his happiest moments had always been followed by the saddest, but for some reason he'd forgotten this one entirely. Perhaps because at the time, it had seemed so simple, so unremarkable. Kushina had shared food with them before other missions, she had wished them good luck. They had always come back before. Suddenly Kakashi realized what his brain had been trying to tell him this entire time. These kids deserved something good from him, something more than just stories and training. Something they could hold on to, like he'd held on to Obito's gift and then Obito's hand, before the end had come. Something good to drive them through the darkness Indra had said was to come. Sasuke had frozen in the doorway, his back to Kakashi, and the Jonin figured similar emotions must be swirling through the boy's own head. He gave a short, jerky nod back at Kakashi, his eyes hidden in his hair, and strode off at a pace slightly below a run. Kakashi figured it was better not to follow him. Besides, if he was going to throw together a picnic, he had a great deal of shopping to do. When Sasuke had told the others, their reactions were what he'd expected. Sakura was happy to spend more time with them, especially him, and Naruto had been excited at the prospect of more food. Sasuke just didn't see the point. Why take everything out of the kitchen, away from a perfectly serviceable table and a warm house, to unpack it on a blanket and freeze to death outside? It was something so irrational, so very Kakashi. Sasuke knew all four of them would be at each other's throats sooner or later. Something would go wrong, because something always went wrong. His uncle would never return from this mission, or he'd stumble out of the trees covered in blood and missing his other arm, or... Sasuke staggered out of the kitchen and towards his room, hand clutching at his chest as it suddenly filled with sharp icy daggers. He noticed he was breathing hard and allowed his knees to give out under him even as he slid the door closed behind him at the sound of footsteps. "Hey Sasuke, you hear that?" Sounded like something fell over. "It's nothing," he gasped, straining to force his voice into the disaffected drawl they'd come to expect from him. Okay," came Naruto's voice, and he could hear Sakura's murmurs as she said something he couldn't catch. He had to send them away, he had to. "Hey Sasuke, we're gonna just stick around here for a bit, okay?" Even as he struggled to breathe, a part of Sasuke still felt exasperated at the Uzumaki's obvious density. "What, just sit in the hallway? I'll work on my calligraphy," he heard his voice say, distantly, somehow sounding perfectly normal as his chest felt like it would tear clean in two. Now he had both hands on his chest, following the movement of his breath, massaging the muscles, trying to get at whatever had so obviously gone wrong inside him. Gods, it hurt. Sasuke squeezed his eyes shut and twisted his face into a grimace even as his mouth fell open. He was not going to cry. He'd sworn to never cry again after that night, so why was this? Some stupid little gimmick Kakashi had thrown together suddenly so painful? Was it some sort of genjutsu? Absently he heard two sets of footsteps on the wooden floor outside, one coming, one going. "What's all this?" he heard Kakashi ask in the mildly bored way that meant he was curious. Naruto made a non-committal noise. "Well," Sasuke said, he was gonna practice calligraphy, "so Sakura and I are gonna play cards out here in the hallway." Sasuke silently thanked the gray-haired idiot for asking the obvious question, even though this was obviously all his fault in the first place. A fresh stab of pain tore through him and he almost doubled over, though the Uchiha stayed silent. I think you've kinda trained all the fun outta us today, Kakashi-sensei. Besides, I'm no good at genjutsu and Sakura-san's no good at taijutsu. I'm just fine at taijutsu, replied the returning girl, the noise of shuffling cardstock coming from the door. You two are just crazy about it. A soft chuckle came from their substitute guardian/bodyguard. When I introduce you to Guy someday your view of crazy dedication will change quite a bit, Sakura. Who's that? Just an old friend. But I won't keep you. There was a soft whoosh of air as the copy ninja shunshined away down the hall. There was silence from the hall as Sasuke tried to focus, tried to push his hands down to regulate his breathing, trying to force his body to obey, but each attempt sent another flood of cold pouring through him and it became harder and harder just to keep his eyes open. He was not going to pass out and die on the floor like this, from some stupid illness. He refused. He wasn't going to let Naruto and Sakura, or Kakashi, or his uncle find him like he'd found. He let out a harsh gasp and folded over himself, nearly bent double on the floor. He would not die, until he'd killed Itachi, or at least died in the attempt. Sasuke thought of his brother, of those ruthless red eyes, lined with red veins, of the blood-spattered sandals, the torn sleeves. The charcoal and linen sketches of his clan members falling around him as his brother showed him the massacre in its full, horrifying detail. Now, the cold in his chest was thawing, its icy heart slowly being supplanted by rage, the same burning rage that was the sole reason for his existence. He would kill Itachi, with his own blade, with his own hands, he would choke the life from him, he would bring his head back to Konoha as proof, and he would be free. The flames of Sasuke's hatred, so much like the fire chakra he'd learned to conjure in his stomach, spread through him with a pleasing burning sensation, dissolving the ice and pain as his chest rose and fell. He stared, unseeing at the space between the floor and his bed as the images drifted across his mind. Itachi collapsing to his knees, bleeding and beaten. His look of surprise, of terror at finally being bested and realization of the consequences. Sasuke imagined the blade in his hands, as long and as smooth as the wooden swords he'd been carving for Kat over hours and hours. He imagined the turn of his body, the pull of his muscles as he put his full weight into the swing, as the sword stamped with the Uchiha crest severed Itachi's head from his body and sent it spiraling to the dirt. Suddenly it wasn't Itachi's head, it was Uncle Kasuke's. His hands had silver gauntlets, and he looked down to see the headless body collapse forwards into a growing pool of blood. Sasuke looked into the results of his work and saw Itachi's face. Now the cold was everywhere, spreading from his chest down his legs, across his arms, up his neck. What equilibrium Sasuke had found was gone and he crawled forward on his hands and knees, teeth gritted even as his breath whistled through them over and over. His fingers felt as tense as bowstrings, like the time he and Itachi had hunted the boar, the time he and Itachi had hunted their clan. He wanted to cry, he wanted to scream, he wanted all of his hatred and fear and pain to flow from him, but the ice refused. It was locking him up, forcing it all inside as the last Uchiha reached his bed frame and clawed his way to a kneeling position. He had to scream, he wanted to, needed it more than he'd ever needed to say anything in his life. Got any twos? Go fish, Naruto. Indistinct grumbling from the other side of the door reminded Sasuke that he couldn't. Even if he died here, from whatever this was, some latent trick of Itachi's, he couldn't let them know. They were already too close, knew too much, Naruto especially. That made them vulnerable, meant Itachi could hear, could come back and... How's the calligraphy, Sasuke? He heard Sakura's voice from outside, slightly distracted at the rustling of cardstock. What are you working on? Bizarrely, the question shoved his mind sideways, away from the cold, the dark spiraling path he'd been on. Away from the heat of his rage, now dulled to an ember as the terror that had filled him receded. It was so casual, so mildly curious, that he couldn't help but respond. Cold, he breathed, and it felt like his lungs emptied themselves entirely along with the word. I'm working on the kanji for cold. Yeah, the temperature's really dropped, hasn't it? Do you think your uncle will like the present we got him? Well, you and I got him. Naruto just signed the wrapping paper because he forgot the card. Hey, an indignant shout came from the hallway, clear even through the doorway and no doubt through several walls. We might have been able to slip the scarf in there because of the wrapping paper, but Indra-san definitely would have noticed if we'd put a card in there too. I didn't forget, I was being tactical about it. Sasuke dragged himself onto the bed as the cold receded still further, giving him back his hands and legs. Something about them, those two, was helping. He noticed that he was breathing through his nose again instead of solely through his mouth, and that was likely the real cause. But the cold still hadn't gone away. Now it was defensive, curled around his heart and settling there with a bone-deep chill that outlined every one of his ribs in pain and tensed muscle. It's a perfectly fine, practical gift. Do you really think he'll like it, Sasuke? He thought of his uncle, of the words scrawled on a scrap of paper they usually used for grocery lists. I'm coming back. A lie, perhaps, or a promise they both knew he alone could not keep. Somehow, in the smallest of ways, it had been reassuring, for it meant that Indra Uchiha really did care, that he cared enough to not leave Sasuke alone again. Even if that did happen, the cold expanded and contracted in the same breath. He knew Indra would fight his hardest before the end, even if it was useless, even if he had lost all of his limbs. Sasuke had felt that same flicker of stubborn determination within his uncle, buried beneath silence, quiet words, and bandages. The rare moments when his eye blazed red and glared, the same way he glared, the same way their father glared. Indra would not die without a fight, perhaps even a fight to enter the Uchiha scrolls in its fierceness, because he had promised to come back. Compared to that, a scarf was a small thing, stupid even. But Naruto had the idea, Sasuke had chosen the color, and Sakura had wrapped it, so that made the fabric bundle a promise of its own. Stay warm, he had written, as a command rather than a plea. But he knew what it really said. Come back to us. Don't leave me alone again. Ah, Sakura, how do you keep doing that? Cards slapped down onto a pile as he heard a small giggle from the hallway. You ask for really obvious cards, Naruto, and there's only so many numbers and suits in the deck. So obviously, I just subtract the cards from my hand, and the cards from yours each time I ask a question, and make educated guesses based on the probability of the top deck cards. Can you say that again, but, slower? I almost got that. The cold was almost gone and Sasuke idly noticed his fingers had twisted themselves into his formerly smooth bedspread. He let go to minor relief as his tension-filled muscles finally relaxed and he returned his attention to his breathing. It was a little deeper than normal, sure, but it didn't hurt to breathe and it was almost back to normal. He realized he'd never answered Sakura's question. Yeah, Sakura. I think he will like it. It was a good idea. There was a sudden silence from the hall before a chirped good, drifted in and she returned to her explanation of card counting. He listened in silence as she talked about the ideas behind casinos and card games, and how the latter would be the easiest to win, once she came of age. Now Naruto was excitedly dreaming of all the things they could do with casino money, like travel to the ruins of Uzushio, or visit Stone's volcano ranges, or go on a fishing trip in the land of waves. The cold and the pain in his chest, the raw terror had been replaced by a chill of a more recognizable kind as Sasuke realized he was covered in sweat, from his hairline to his chest and lower back, soaking his shirt as if he'd been fighting Kakashi for 2 hours straight. He rose into a half-sitting position and stripped off the shirt and flung it across the room in the general direction of his closet. Father had always told him a tidy room meant a tidy mind, but Sasuke was too tired to care. He flopped back on top of his covers as his eyelids became heavier and soon he drifted off to the sounds of his friends chatting through his door. He heard his name once or twice, but soon it was clear they weren't really expecting a response, even if he'd heard enough to give it. Soon he was fast asleep. Chapter 29, Missing Pieces. Naruto absently rubbed his stomach as Sakura explained the rules of blackjack as within him the nine-tailed fox growled in frustration. It paced back and forth in front of the golden bars and the accursed seal as its stomach rumbled. As a creature of chakra, it did not and never would eat like humans ate. It had no true need for sustenance, though it possessed a stomach and had devoured plenty of wicked mortals in the past. There had been that incident with Kinkaku and Ginkaku, but the Kyuubi refused to acknowledge those thieves. Perhaps it had been foolish. Its encounter with the older Uchiha, the one full of humility and concern and warnings for the Biju, had made it overconfident. He had drawn more and more negative energy from the stones and roofs and earth of the Uchiha district to rebuild his yang energy. He had glutted himself on the hatred, pain, and misery of his hated oppressors, but especially the boy. He had grown accustomed to his nightly habits, of dream-walking across the space between sleeping minds, of tasting the boy's fears, his terror, sketched in ebony and tasting like the harshest sake. Delicious, but now, he saw, dangerous as well. For now the boy was asleep, and as his mind sank into itself, the nightmares rose to surround it with renewed force. And the Kyuubi was not there to devour them. His prison, his jailer, his stupid, idiot Uzumaki cage was awake, and as long as that was the case, he was trapped here. The fox had become a dam, holding back the waters of the Uchiha boy's suffering, all the wickedness his maddened brother had inflicted, which had tasted so wonderful and had made the fox so much stronger. But now, the fox could not reach him, and so the dam was gone. Months of nightmares, of horrors, of human frailty crashed down upon Sasuke Uchiha's mind, and despite himself, the fox grimaced and threw himself at the cage bars. If the boy's mind broke, if he was shattered, then the dreams would be gone, and the fox would starve once more. When the screams began, both Naruto and Sakura dropped their cards. The Uzumaki practically hit the ceiling while Sakura scrambled to her feet and reached for the door. A hand reached out to grasp hers, and Naruto and Sakura shared a look of silent understanding. They hadn't been idiots. With his uncle gone, Sasuke had taken to pacing the house and had snapped at them with more than his normal blunt statements. When he'd staggered his way into his room and slammed the door, Naruto had found Sakura. They'd given Kakashi, who was obviously the cause, a glare worthy of the third Hokage, and settled into afternoon sentry duty. They pretended to ignore the gasps, the heavy breathing, the thumps as Sasuke crawled or stumbled, and both breathed a sigh of relief when the noise of sagging springs meant he'd at least reached the bed. They'd played Go Fish to at least pretend things were normal, that their friend wasn't going through the same snappish, painful cycle they'd endured after that first visit with Indra. Naruto kept throwing worried looks at the door while Sakura had divided her attention between the cerebral and fulfilling effort of counting cards, while her inner self continued to rant and fret over Sasuke's health. If that worry expressed itself in a mixture of medical knowledge and promises of violent retribution upon the Uchiha, well, that was Inner's problem, not Sakura's. Now that he was screaming, really, painfully screaming, heedless of volume, they threw caution to the winds and threw the door open as one. His hands were locked around his head, fingers curled into claws as his body attempted to force itself into wakefulness from pressure or pain alone. Sakura saw tiny rivers of blood begin to run down his cheeks, tangling into his hair and sending scattered drops to stain the sheets as he thrashed. Inner prodded to her, indicating the sweaty, discarded blue shirt, and she brought it over at once. In any other circumstance, the girl might have paid more attention to Sasuke's chest, or been grossed out by the sweaty shirt, but today those details were meaningless. She tried to force first his hands, then his arms away from his head, but they were locked in with desperate strength, even as he harmed himself. She wrapped the shirt around his head as best she could to collect the blood and exchanged a terrified glance with Naruto, who had locked down Sasuke's thrashing legs in a bear hug with what seemed like ease. She'd been training, she had muscles too, now. Switch, she yelled at him over their friend's screams. Get his hands away before he claws his eyes out or something. Naruto nodded and she moved over to wrap her own arms around the legs even as he let go. Whatever met strength had locked Sasuke's arms around his head didn't extend to his feet, because despite his wild kicks, she was able to hold him easily. Naruto's strength, for better or for worse, was above even Sasuke's, and the one time he'd landed a punch on Kakashi, it had sent the Jonin back several inches on the wooden floor. The blonde strained with first one arm, then both, bracing his foot on the corner of the bed, and succeeded in forcing one of Sasuke's hands away from his head, which he promptly grabbed in another bear hug, drawing him closer, and he winced as the screams came closer. Suddenly Kakashi was there, headband pushed up, concern and worry written all over his face. They saw the jawline of his mask move, but Sasuke was too loud, the room too close, and they shook their heads to indicate their deafness. Kakashi ripped his mask down and mouthed the words slowly as Sakura silently thanked the gods she'd paid attention during their lesson on lip reading. What's happening to him? Inner and outer Sakura exchanged dozens of hypotheses in seconds, relying on their experience with the prickly Uchiha and information gleaned from everything from Psychology Today to Shinobi Trauma Responses Volume 12. Panic attack, she mouthed, no idea why. Kakashi nodded and he leaned over Sasuke's face, wincing as well at the volume of his cries, which were still wordless, for all the terror and pain they communicated. With one gloved hand he peeled open one eye and appeared to pause with indecision until Naruto head-butted his shoulder. Do something, the blonde pleaded, worry and not a little terror of his own written all over his face. Whatever Kakashi had been worried about vanished and the man's lips set into a determined line. Inner Sakura idly noted he had very long canines and a small beauty mark and filed that away for later as the Jonin cupped Sasuke's face with one hand and levered open an eye with the other. Neither of the children saw his Sharingan activate, but Sasuke's screams redoubled. If he'd been in pain and afraid before, Sasuke's new screams went even further. They were the screams of an animal that was wounded and knew it was about to die, the screams any creature, human, beast, or chakra construct recognized instinctively. They were screams that struck at the core of the soul, that warned of horrible danger and to run, run, run. The Kyuubi gnashed its teeth in frustration. It had fed on the wickedness of the Uchiha, and the memories of that wickedness in the boy and its resurgence was going to shatter his spirit in two and leave him a comatose vegetable, bereft of any dreams for him to harvest. The fox tried to convince itself. This was one of the last clansmen of its hated enemy, its destruction would leave one less pair of Sharingan to possibly control him. It would be a kinder fate than suffering through a life of hatred. There were other dreamers, other shinobi with wickedness in their hearts. It had smelled that Umbu, could smell him now, clear across the village, the monkey. Steeped in wickedness, yes, he could feast on that one for a long time indeed. He could continue to rebuild his Yang Chakra by inciting the Uzumaki. The death of his friend could break him, could perhaps even free the Kyuubi from its cage with the right coaxing. But he was just a boy. The Uchiha held hatred, yes, but it was another's poison that pumped through his soul. Left alone, the boy would have been kind, perhaps good, even if he'd been born an Uchiha. He had devoured the boy's nightmares to strengthen himself, but also because it was his duty. The old man had charged him with devouring the wickedness of mortals, burning away the rot before it spread, and he had done so in many ways, for many lifetimes. Before the villages. Before wood and eyes and golden chains and the word that before had only belonged to the old man. Before Jinchuriki. Before this Jinchuriki, the flesh who was blind, deaf, and nearly dumb to his presence, who had not even a realization of who was trapped inside his Uzumaki soul. The Kyuubi flung itself against the bars, once, twice, 3 times in fury and hatred. Hatred for his situation, hatred for the boys, but most of all, hatred for the inability to carry out its duty. His duty. Kurama's duty. If there truly is no other way. He wasn't doing this for the boy. He wasn't doing this out of charity, or because he felt guilty at the pain his dream walking had caused. What did he care? He was doing this because it was his duty, and because that Uchiha was too tempting a morsel to lose. Not when he'd grown accustomed to feeding on those nightmares. So Kurama, the 9-tailed fox, the Kyuubi, the 9 burning rages, the cleansing flames of the Kami, cast his consciousness up and out, beyond the boundaries of his cage and towards the soul of Naruto Uzumaki. Listen up, you idiot, and listen hard. Naruto froze and Sasuke's arm nearly wrenched itself out of his grip before he clung tighter. Whatever Kakashi-sensei was trying, it wasn't working and really just made things worse. But he could have sworn he'd just heard a voice. A voice in his head. I'm only telling you this once. The Uchiha brat's drowning in nightmares, and if you want him to live, you have to let me eat them. The brat will live, but if this goes on, he'll crack like a Buddhist monk at a brothel. Naruto shook his head wildly and glanced at Sakura and Kakashi, who were staring at Sasuke with single-minded intensity of fear and frustration. Did you guys hear that voice? Sakura bared her teeth, and if she had her hands free, she would have punched him, he was sure. Now's not the right time for jokes, Naruto. I'm serious, protested the blonde even as Sasuke's scrabbling nails drew red lines down his chin. Somebody's talking in my head about Sasuke's nightmares. Kakashi had gone very still, as if the howling boy underneath him suddenly didn't exist. His voice was hard and his glare was only intensified by the red and black of his transplanted Sharingan. What did the voice say? Naruto's throat suddenly felt very dry. He said he needed to eat Sasuke's nightmares before he dash. Cracked like a Buddhist monk at a brothel. Went totally nuts. Comatose. Permanent vegetative state. Drowned in Uchiha evil. Whichever. Sasuke's going to totally lose it, said Naruto as his voice reached a higher, even more terrified pitch as he realized who, or rather, what, was somehow speaking to him. Kakashi drew a kunai from his leg holster with deliberate slowness, and even though his eyes met Naruto's, the blonde knew he was looking somewhere else entirely. "Can someone explain what the heck is going on?" yelled Sakura, close to tears with frustration and fear. "The only way to save the boy is to knock this one out. Then I can dream walk across and devour the nightmares the way I have for the past 6 months. I save my food source and the Uchiha gets to keep his brain. Everybody wins." Kakashi-sensei, did you hear that?" The Jonin gave a single nod, but did not break eye contact with Naruto. "You've gotta knock me out." The boy's jaw set in determination even as his hands still held Sasuke down. "You have 10 seconds. Kakashi raised his hand but stopped. Truly, openly harming Minato's son, could he? A fist crashed into Naruto's jaw, fueled by fear, confusion, anger, and 62 pounds of pink-haired girl as the blonde dropped like a sack of potatoes. Even before he had collapsed into Kakashi's arms, Sasuke's screaming lessened. It fell from the mortal terror of someone who was about to die, to the cries of a child in pain, then to broken sobs, then nothing. Sakura stumbled into Kakashi's kneeling form and barely managed to avoid falling to the floor herself. He impulsively reached an arm out and held the girl close to his flak jacket as she cried and allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. "We're okay," he repeated and ignored the wetness in his own eyes, like he was chanting a prayer. "We're okay, we're okay, we're okay." Behind them, Sasuke slept peacefully once more. Kurama tore a memory in half and gulped down the red sky, with the charcoal street of corpses to follow. Delicious, necessary, but possibly yet another mistake. He'd spoken with his cage and with the Sharingan thief. They knew he had awakened and that he could dream walk, an oversight the 8-sign seal had not accounted for. It had never been meant to seal a tailed beast, but it had served its purpose. Now the mortals knew and could take steps to limit even this tiny freedom he'd discovered. Of course, to do so condemned the Uchiha boy to madness, as he'd just demonstrated, so perhaps he was safe for now. A dream of bloody vengeance tried to flee, but he pounced upon it and worried it in his teeth until only the emotion remained, stripped of detail. Yes, he was safe. He had saved the boy, and if he simply continued his feast, night after night, it would be something. Perhaps it would earn the Uzumaki's trust. It was the smallest chink in his prison, barely even a glimmer of hope from within these dark and putrid sewers, but Kurama grinned with bloody and fear-stained teeth. Perhaps one day, I will be free. Chapter 30, Operation Harmony PT2, Desperate Times, Desperate Measures, Desperate Men. They ran on 2 legs or crawled on 4. They slithered on the tile or writhed through the air. Some of them had jaws with fanged mouths, some of them had suckers full of acid, some of them had jagged beaks. In form they were varied, but their purpose was clear. Each one of the thousands of creatures the size of dogs smelled of spices, and each one hungered for the flesh and chakra of men. Orochimaru emitted a peal of mad, cackling laughter as Indra spun away and tore back to the other Umbu, ignoring the 3 senbon that embedded themselves in his back, just above the shoulder blade. It didn't matter, even if it limited his movement. What mattered was the tide of acidic white flesh that poured down towards the battling ninja, even as some of them turned to confront it. One of the horned, red-skinned twins had a deep gash from shoulder to him that bled fiercely despite his attempts to stymie it, and he had the bad luck to be closest to the cells. They poured over him even as his claws flashed and shredded several to ribbons, even as his mouth spat fire, but the creatures did not care. He was vulnerable, and he was meat, so they devoured him even as their acid melted his claws and left holes in his skin. Red blood spurted out from the writing pile that had been Seikon or Yukon seconds before, and the remaining combatants leaped away with cries of horror towards the center of the room. Indra raised his voice. To me, Leaf Shinobi. I'll form a barrier. The masked figures followed his orders, and Indra counted swiftly as one by one, they reached his position in the center of the room. All of them had acid burns of some kind, either on armor, clothes, or exposed skin, but every Umbu was accounted for. Indra's eyes spent bloody tears once more as the Amaterasu raced across the floor along his sight line, sometimes inches ahead of the growling, hissing, oozing creatures. He spun in a circle and the Umbu ducked down, so they were soon completely encased in a wall of black flames once more, even as the temperature skyrocketed. He felt the blood roll off his cheek and drip down from his chin and wiped it away to make sure not a drop landed on his scarf. Wearing it, he reflected, may have been a Naruto-level stupid idea. Now they were out of immediate danger, he took in his squad. Kat had several long slashes on her arms and shoulders where she'd covered her head and neck. Beetle was wrapping bandages across a slash that had mirrored the one on the sound ninja who'd been devoured. Pheasant was splashing isopropyl alcohol across an open sizzling wound on his forehead where one of the creatures had lodged before he'd carved it in half with an already useless kunai. The leaf headband had saved him from the worst of it, but it was already half eaten away. The Yamanaka root agent discarded it and slapped a patch on his face. Raven had backed away from the group as they slashed at the slimy, limbless thing on top of their mask, the hissing acid eating into the black and white mask slowly compared to what Indra had seen from the others. Their hood was gone, revealing short black hair and weathered skin. "You are not fit to touch this mask," hissed Raven. "You are a vile, wretched thing that has lived far too long already." With emphasis, Raven brought a vacuum blade kunai up and severed the creature from the mask even as their second kunai threw the creature into the black flames to be consumed. It wailed as it died, but Indra wouldn't have cared if it had recited haikus, because a sweat-stained Shimura Danzo stared back at him with an expression somewhere between frustration and resignation. The old man gave a slight shrug of his shoulders but said nothing more, so Indra bit back the curses he wanted to scream and turned his back on the man. All of them were alive and more or less whole, but the same could not be said for the sound ninja. At a gesture, the flames around them lessened just a little, enough to see through the inky black chakra and gauge their situation. Some of the surviving sound ninja had formed a tall, poisonously purple barrier around their lord, who was carving more of the white leech beasts from the remaining twin with a disappointed expression. Indra noted that his kusanagi remained whole as the acidic flesh dissolved around it. Had it been treated in some way, or was it simply another mystical property of the grass's treasured sword? It didn't matter because Orochimaru began to speak, his voice carrying clearly over the chittering of his creations and the crackle of black flames. "Calm yourself, Seikon, this is survivable. Unfortunately," and here his lip twisted into what was definitely a grimace, "the same cannot be said for Kimimaro." They all looked down at the bone wielder, whose left arm had grown into a massive bony shield that even now was retracting back into his ulna, as dissolved bone dripped into his inner organs alongside the acid of what must have been several dozen creatures. His chest was wide open, Indra could see his body pumping frantically, chakra system surging energy to his bone structures as he worked to limit the damage. "Lord Orochimaru," croaked the teenager, his expression of faint worry, then beatific bliss, "you are safe." Orochimaru nodded and held Seikon up by the scruff of his neck. "Yes, Kimimaro, you have succeeded once again. I am safe." With that, he drew the body shifter up and slammed the boy into the Kaguya teenager on the ground. Both screamed as the former's ability activated and first their skin, then their very cells fused and spread, bringing new flesh to open wounds, and fresh bone to reinforce it. It sounded extremely painful but Orochimaru tooted. A less than optimal experiment, given the field conditions, but ah well, needs must. I must preserve dear Kimimaro if he is to be my new body. "Lord Orochimaru," groaned the red-haired teenager closest to Indra's party, "the 4 flames are meant to have 4 goddamn shinobi, not 3. I can't bear the weight much longer. That must be Teiwa, the flute girl." Out of the corner of his eye he saw Danzo raise his singular eyebrow and Indra knew the man was just as reluctantly impressed as he was. The 4 flames barrier ninjutsu had been designed from the ground up for 4 shinobi and this girl was apparently carrying the weight of 2 corners on her own. "Lord, we must leave," she begged. "Oh, very well Teiwa. Stand close and stay prepared. Jirobo, carry those 2, I believe the merging has rendered them unconscious for the time being." "Kidomaru." Indra's attention fades as he spins on his heel to see the Umbu already standing up, hands tied around weapons partially ruined by acid and ready to fight. For a moment, Indra's heart swells as he thinks of his team, his Naruto, and that last desperate rush to Uzushio. They had been determined then too, they could still win. Past and future together. "We're not going to let them get away, however they plan to do so," he vowed. "Here's the plan, I'm going to shrink our barrier until it's as small and as precise as I can get it without anybody catching on fire. I can put it out, but that will take time and energy we do not have. We're going to plow through these things, get to Orochimaru, and separate his head from his goddamned neck. Anything gets through, kill it. We stop for nothing. Clear. They nodded and Indra gave a silent prayer of relief. Danzo at least had enough sense to defer to his command when under fire. Which was smart because if he had argued, Indra would have killed the man and damned the consequences. Tagging along on an Umbu mission as a 67-year-old man, no matter his skill, was bordering on suicidal. Arguing in an active combat situation was a close second. Then the purple barrier fell as the sound ninja screamed in terror and they were all running as if the death god itself were chasing them. Orochimaru was in the center, surrounded by Teiwa and Jirobo, while Kodomaru's 6 arms held something out in front of them that glowed with a sickly green light. Indra's Sharingan ached when he looked, even blocked as it was by the spider mimic's body, and he felt the eye attempt to retreat to the normal visual spectrum, but he forced more chakra into his ocular pathways and his chakra sight returned. He brought his hands together as his eye bled again, almost in apology for its reluctance, and Amaterasu's flames shrunk to wrap around them. Soon the Konoha shinobi were covered in a seamless cocoon of black flames above and around them. They ran forward, following the green light and their enemy as the white creatures fled from Orochimaru's artifact and immolated themselves in the Amaterasu with a cacophony of pops. Not content to skulk around the leaf shinobi, Orochimaru's hungry abominations threw themselves at the flesh beyond the fire and died in the dozens, then, as they picked up speed, by the hundreds. Whether confident in their superior numbers or simply driven to frenzy by the smell of blood, there was no stopping for any of them. The sound ninja raced through hidden tunnels, slid down staircases, and ran up vertical shafts as they sought to lose their pursuers, but the Umbu were relentless, fighting through the pain of their wounds with deep breaths and studied ignorance of biology. "You surprised me, Danzo," taunted Orochimaru from ahead of them. "Of all the people, I would never have expected you to work with an Uchiha. After all, how many of those eyeballs did you want me to implant into Shin's arm? 12? 20? There were quite a lot, to be sure. Are they still in cold storage or have you used them by now? Which one is in your head right now? Fugaku's perhaps." Indra felt Kat's hand reach out to grab his shoulder, but he made no move toward Danzo and he could feel the gazes of the Umbu behind him boring into his head. Now was not the time. He'd killed Danzo for that once already. "I will work with whoever I must if it is to defend the beauty and peace of the Leaf Village, Orochimaru no Yushigoro. Whatever task, whatever needs, they have always been for the Leaf." Even with the black flames and writhing beasts between them, they saw Orochimaru flinch and turn his head to glare at the leader of Root. "How could you possibly dash? You have disappointed me, Orochimaru no Yushigoro," said Danzo with finality, and he did indeed sound disappointed. "So I wash my hands of you at long last. You were only ever interested in yourself, and I should have seen it sooner. Don't pretend you were any different," hissed Orochimaru and bared his fangs, which were dripping poison onto the ground even as they ran. "You were the one who encouraged my experiments on enemy shinobi, encouraged me to continue them when the war was over, brought me subjects you said nobody would miss. Don't hide behind the village's fig leaf and pretend to be some noble shinobi serving a kind village." Danzo's eye twitched and he sped up, shouldering Indra aside and nearly leaping into the Amaterasu in his fury. "And you never complained. At every step, you were right there with me, with your scalpels and chakra maps and theories. At every step, you kept pushing, because you wanted to see what would happen, how you could make yourself perfect. Your hands were working on those children right there, next to mine." The hallways were sloping up, growing more populated, and Indra saw several shinobi in Umbu black or sound purple flatten themselves into neighboring tunnels as the tide of beasts and black fire rushed past. One unlucky sound Chunin collided with the bubble of Amaterasu and screamed as he fell to the floor, and then the beasts were upon him and the ninja were gone. Indra and the rest of the Umbu, as well as the sound ninja, remained spellbound as their feet carried them on. Orochimaru let out something that was close to a laugh and close to a sob, and Indra had never imagined the Sunin could make such a noise, had never imagined that even in the face of his death Orochimaru would be anything other than perfectly composed in his terror and dread. Now he looked as if he were willing to risk Amaterasu's flames just to wrap his fingers around Danzo's throat. "I asked you," he shouted, and Indra realized the snake had also never raised his voice, in either of his lives. I asked you to make it an order, that my work was sanctioned officially by Konoha, that I would be protected. And what happened when Hiruzen stormed into my lab, which was so useful for you to dispose of Nosy Umbu? His golden eyes flashed as Danzo looked away. You weren't there. Why weren't you there? I could not, said the leader of Root, struggling to regain some of his calm. It was I who changed the parameters of that mission to capture or kill instead of simple execution. It was I who placed the unbalanced Hatake along your escape route to give you an easy path to the border. Even now, it was I who allowed you to survive this long, in your little nest of vipers. He let out a short bark of satisfaction at Orochimaru's narrowed eyes. Did you think your hidden village would survive this long while you collected wayward bloodlines, hunted ancient weapons, and took in missing ninja at every opportunity? No, I allowed you to play your little game with the land of rice paddies, allowed you to pretend that you truly deserved the title of Kage, even in a backwater nation. I had hoped you would make something of yourself, but this, Danzo flung out his arm at the madness that separated the two ninja. Whatever madness inspired you to create such monstrosities is too far by half Yashe Goro. Even now, they threaten the land of fire, and if you were stupid enough to allow these things the ability to breed, they will be a plague upon this earth, just like you. He spat in the direction of Orochimaru's feet and neither cared that fire dissolved the phlegm in a wisp of steam. That will be your legacy, the change you brought to this world in search of immortality. A collection of tortured, freakish ninja and a horde of maggots from the stars. Suddenly Orochimaru's blade was in his hand and it shot forward, heedless of the celestial maggots and their acid, heedless of the black flames, and Indra barely had time to shout drop before it struck home. Danzo staggered back as blood flowed from his shoulder, staining white robes red and making black robes glisten. Indra felt a small cut open on his cheek as the blade passed over him and skidded to his knees to avoid further damage. There was a wet noise and a quiet huh of lost air as he looked back to see the point of the sword neatly separate Beetle's head from his shoulders. The first fell forward, following its owner's momentum, while the heavy body rocked back at the force of the blow. Kat's hand snatched the masked head out of the air before it could hit the ground and she stared dumbly at her prize. Pheasant noticed the black flames already starting to spread over Beetle's body and heaved the corpse out of Indra's barrier. At once, the celestial maggots swarmed it, chittering and oozing in excitement at the bounty of their hunt, and the creatures even drew away from the rest of the groups as the feeding frenzy grasped them once more. Indra could feel his chakra lowering, could feel the strain building behind his singular eye, and prayed he wasn't going to discover a new additional level of blindness that could affect even the eternal Mangekyo. Not now, he prayed. Amaterasu, preserve us. You. Kat was rising, cradling the masked head of her friend in one arm, and a glimmering sword in the other. Though her mask suggested a smirk at a private joke, the eyes behind it were positively seething with fury as she glared at Orochimaru. I'll kill you for that. As if to punctuate the statement, the very stone around them shook as something truly massive exploded above them, and for the first time Orochimaru looked uncertain as yet another variable entered the equation of battle. Well, you already summoned your reinforcements, said Indra as he drew his sword and Danzo brandished a wind-wrapped kunai. So we thought it would only be fair to summon ours. Their chase emerged from beneath the earth in an explosion of stone, black flame, and writhing celestial maggots. As Danzo and Kat launched themselves, Orochimaru, the fury written across their features mirrored in the snake's own. He ducked a swing of Danzo's blade and launched a riposte and a rearing snake from his sleeve at the same time. Kat blocked the sword and decapitated the snake, and she passed over Orochimaru's shoulder and into the wider battle around them. It was absolute chaos, and any pretense of cordon lines, capture teams, and termination squads had completely broken down. Sound Jonin exchanged jutsu with Leaf Umbu, a Hyagachonin urged fleeing civilians away from the combat, and fountains of writhing celestial maggots chewed their way from the earth or rained from exit holes within false trees as a few sound ninja threw green-gray dust that caused the beasts to turn and writhe in the other direction. Indra flipped through the signs and even spat a few majestic dragon flames into the sky for good measure, but the Sound Four managed to avoid every one. Pheasant charged at Kidomaru, targeting not the man's many arms, but the weathered carving in his hands, only for two hardened hands to catch his descending blade and snap it clean in two. They spiraled downward, neither paying attention to the pull of gravity even as Orochimaru curved his body around a dying Umbu and slithered towards the tree branches. Danzo and Kat were in hot pursuit and Indra charged to join them, only for a massive giant and a thin red-haired woman to block his path. Lord Orochimaru's orders, breathed Teiwa and licked her lips as Jirobo tied the comatose Kimimaro to his back behind her. If he didn't attend to it, we were to take your fucking eye. The black sigils of the curse marks spiraled out across their bodies and merged as their skin darkened into the leathery substance Indra had known from both his own curse and long association with Yugo. Pissin' on your corpse was strictly optional, obviously. Language, Teiwa, chided the red-skinned giant beside her as he cracked his knuckles. You know such behavior is unbecoming of a shinobi. In response, the Uchiha unclipped his cloak and tossed it high with a flourish and the small smirk that was his version of a grin. If they wanted to intimidate him, well, two could play at that game. So is joining an international criminal and kidnapping test subjects. When you weren't under the knife yourself. And yet, here you are. He spread his sword and stumped out in a welcoming gesture, still untouched by the battle raging around them. If you want to surrender, I will gladly accept it now. As if. Jirobo. The big man nodded and dived into the earth, which prompted several stone spikes to immediately launch themselves up from the area Indra had been standing a moment before. He rose upward and watched as Teiwa brought her flute to her lips, only to bring it up in a block as his lightning-enhanced sword aimed for her stomach. The blade met the metal shell of the flute with a loud, discordant note and Indra allowed himself to be impressed as the world around them wavered into something pinkish and indistinct. Then the note died away and the image died with it as the girl shoved his sword away, careful to keep the flute between her hand and the sword at all times. They landed on the side of a tree trunk and exchanged several more blows as ninja around them stumbled or paused at the sound of the notes, which their opponents capitalized on without fail. Curious technique, commented Indra as bodies began to fall from above them and he tied a roll of razor wire to a shuriken with his teeth. Auditory genjutsu pose an interesting challenge to the visually focused Sherry-non, but do you really think you can face me? Teiwa tucked her hair behind both one of her short horns and her ear and grinned in a way that reminded him vividly of a little blonde boy just before he pulled a particularly wicked prank. This flute has been in my family for 3 generations, she said proudly as she held it out to catch a rain of blood from a dying sound Chunin. I grew up hearing stories of how it had conquered every visual jutsu it encountered. Her hands flipped through several signs as she brought the flute to her lips and the blood flowed against gravity and through the instrument in a haunting melody. Summoning Jutsu, 3 raging demons. Indra twisted sideways as a massive iron club smashed clean through the tree they'd been standing on and 3 hulking forms converged on him. Of course, Teiwa had to add, these demons help too. Ah, but Indra missed the Susanoo at times like these. He feinted forwards as the girl resumed her flute playing and the demons moved in perfect synchronization to respond to his attacks. The one wrapped head to toe in bandages would impose itself whenever he sought to break away, keeping him within the girl's range while the one with the club and the other with clawed gauntlets swung away at him in silent fury. He crouched low as the massive club passed over his head and sprang over its head as his sword sang the eternal chirping song of the Chidori. The demon with the gauntlets made to block with one and impale him with the other, but Indra didn't bother to escape the blow as his eye burned once more. The ogre moaned through stitched lips as Indra's sword carved clean through its wrist and shattered the wooden claw as well as its hand. The fire of Amaterasu that Indra had summoned instead of a purple ribcage provided no cushioning and he was catapulted across the clearing into and under the roots of a spacious tree. Now the demon had ripped the stitches from its lips entirely and was howling as the purifying flames spread across its body and Teiwa watched in shock. You took that blow, just so you could set my doki on fire. Indra shook dirt and some unfortunate centipedes from his hair and threw his sword out of the hole for more climbing room. Consider it a premature apology for when I break your nose. Of course, with Orochimaru out of his immediate vision and battle all around, he was slipping back into the easy banter his Naruto had always encouraged to keep their spirits up as they fought the Otsutsuki or the corpse creatures that protected them. There was also a certain amount of masochism peeking through as the uniforms, sights, and smells of the Sound Village brought back 2.5 years' worth of memories. If a little pain was all that was needed to take them out faster, well, Sarada thought he'd deserved it. With only the barest tremor of warning, massive stone arms erupted from the ground and pulled him back down as a vast stone golem emerged to hold him in place for the iron club that filled his vision. On instinct, desperately, Indra reached for the vast warrior, his purple armored protector, and found nothing. His Rinnegan was gone, and with it, the two open ocular pathways through which the Guardian could manifest. He'd been foolish, overconfident in his knowledge and his power, but no amount of black flame could halt or even deter something moving that fast. Even as the second demon was consumed, it followed the command of its mistress, and Indra felt ribs give way as he was driven back into the stone of Jirobo's earth golem. His last thought before he blacked out was from the intelligence report Danzo had given him a month before. Probably shattered every rib he had. Every rib he had. Every rib. Check the description for the links to the author.